Hello everyone, welcome to Sleepy Crimes Hub. I'm here with you tonight to help you relax and slowly fall asleep. I know many of you are watching this video to rest your mind. So before we begin, please like the video and subscribe to the channel. Tell me in the comments, where are you watching from and what time is it right now? Now get comfortable, close your eyes if you like, take a deep breath, and let go of the day. Let's gently begin with case 1. The story begins quietly, the kind of quiet that hides something deeply wrong. On the morning of March 24th, 1872, in the rural silence of Kings Prairie Township, Missouri, Lee Monroe Betterton was born into a farming family already stretched thin. He was one of 15 children raised by Leland Betterton and Mary Catherine Betterton, a life shaped by hard labor, poverty, and discipline. Very little is known about his childhood, but those who later look back believe the seeds of violence were planted early, hidden beneath the appearance of an ordinary farm boy growing into an ordinary young. Betterton married Laura Elizabeth McCoy, and together they built what looked like a respectable family life. They had several children and lived quietly on their farm, known in the community as simple people minding their own business. Betterton's only run-ins with the law were minor issues involving unpaid fines, nothing that suggested the darkness to come. To outsiders, it was a normal marriage. Inside the home, however, something was breaking. By the year 1904, the marriage had become volatile. Arguments were frequent and intense, echoing through the farmhouse walls. One night, during a particularly violent dispute, Betterton lost control. In a fit of rage, he beat Laura so severely that she collapsed, unconscious and unresponsive. Alarmed neighbors rushed in, carrying her to a nearby hospital. She never recovered. Laura Elizabeth McCoy died from her injuries shortly after. Shockingly, and for reasons never fully explained, Betterton was never charged for her death. The law turned away, and a man who should have faced justice walked free. Not long after Laura's death, Betterton hired a Choctaw woman named Rose Hudson as a housekeeper. Over time, their professional relationship turned personal. They began living together as husband and wife, though never formally married. But history repeated itself. Their relationship was unstable, marked by arguments and separations. Rose left him several times, yet always returned, trapped in a cycle of fear, attachment, and hope that things might change. In late December of 1906, another argument erupted. Rose left once again, but felt compelled to accompany Betterton to Verona, where his children were staying with their grandfather. After some time there, the two decided to return home together. They boarded a train, and during the journey, Betterton drank heavily, consuming large amounts of whiskey. When they got off at Pier City, instead of waiting for another train, they chose to walk toward Monet on foot. It was a decision that would seal Rose Hudson's fate. Along the dark, quiet road, another argument broke out. Drunk, enraged, and armed with a knife, Betterton attacked. He stabbed Rose 3 times, each wound deliberate and fatal. She collapsed onto the ground, bleeding and barely conscious. As she lay dying, Betterton poured whiskey over her face, a chilling act that showed not panic, but cruelty. Nearby train crew members witnessed the scene, overpowered him, and dragged him to jail. There, without hesitation, he confessed. His only defense was that he had been drunk. At a tea trial in Mount Vernon, Betterton pleaded guilty to murder. He was sentenced to 99 years in prison, a punishment that suggested he would never walk free again. Yet fate, in a flawed justice system, had other plans. That on September 25, 1917, Betterton was paroled, despite being a convicted murderer. He returned to Monet and soon met another woman, Elzada Lockwood. Within a year, they married and settled into a home in the southern part of the town. To neighbors, they appeared happy. Their only known tragedy was a house fire in late March of 1919, believed to be accidental. But behind closed doors, the pattern of violence had returned. The marriage quickly collapsed. They divorced, then remarried on the first day of July. The same day, Elzada's daughter and Betterton's son were married. To celebrate, the families traveled to Veneta, Oklahoma. On the 9th of July, they returned for another visit. While other family members were away from the house, An argument broke out between Betterton and Elzada. This time, he did not reach for a knife. He pulled out a revolver and shot her 3 times. She fell to the floor, dying. As the gun smoke lingered, Betterton turned the weapon toward his daughter-in-law. Before he could pull the trigger, his son Ernest rushed in, wrestled the revolver from his father's hands, and saved her life. When neighbors arrived, Betterton attempted to blame his own son for the murder. No one believed him. He was arrested immediately. While awaiting trial, he made chilling threats, vowing to kill himself and his entire family if he was ever released. His trial began in late July of 1919. After months of testimony, including statements from his own children, the jury found him guilty. He was sentenced to death. The judge openly expressed disappointment, emphasizing the horror of a father whose own children testified against him. Even then, Betterton claimed innocence. While on death row, he was granted a mental evaluation. Doctors concluded he was fully sane and understood exactly what he had done. His execution date was set for the 9th of July, 1920, exactly 1 year after Elzada's murder. On the day of his execution, he released a statement declaring himself innocent but ready to meet God. At noon, inside the Oklahoma State Penitentiary in McAllister, Lee Monroe Betterton was executed in the electric chair. His final words were calm and chilling in their simplicity. "Goodbye, and God bless you all." This case leaves behind a haunting truth: how violence ignored becomes violence repeated. Betterton was given chances, pardons, and freedoms he did not deserve, and each time, someone paid with their life. His story is not just about one man, but about a system that failed to stop him before it was too late. If stories like this remind you why justice matters, make sure to share your thoughts, stay aware, and never ignore the warning signs hidden behind silence. Case 2. The story opens in silence, the kind that hides long-term damage rather than sudden shock. In Staten Island, New York, a boy named Richard Biegenwald was born into a home where violence was routine and fear was normal. His alcoholic father beat him frequently, and by the time most children were learning safety and affection, Richard was learning pain. At an age when innocence should have been protected, his mind was already unraveling. Before he even reached primary school, he set his family home on fire, an act so alarming that authorities sent him for psychiatric observation. From the very beginning, the warning signs were loud, but no one truly stopped to listen. As he grew older, the behaviors only escalated. By childhood standards, his actions were disturbing and unnatural. While other children played games, Richard drank alcohol, gambled, and lived with impulses far beyond his years. Still a child, he underwent electroshock therapy at Bellevue Hospital in New York, a harsh treatment that failed to bring stability. Instead of healing, he was passed through institutions, eventually ending up in a state training school for boys in Warwick. There, he was known not for reform, but for theft, manipulation, and encouraging other boys to escape. Even visits home were tainted, as he stole money from his own mother. At one point, he even set himself on fire inside her home, an act that symbolized a boy completely detached from self-preservation. When he was released as a teenager and briefly attended high school, it lasted only weeks. Education could not hold him, and structure never stayed. Soon after, he drifted to Nashville, Tennessee, where crime became his way of surviving. He stole a car, crossed state lines, and was arrested by federal agents. By the late 1950s, he returned to Staten Island, but the damage was already permanent. He did not return as a rehabilitated young man, but as someone hardened and dangerous. Not long after his return, Biegenwald stole another vehicle and drove to Bayonne, New Jersey. There, in mid-December of 1958, his violence reached a new level. Alongside an accomplice, he robbed a grocery store. During the robbery, he shot and killed the store's owner, Stephen Sladowski, a man who was also an attorney and prosecutor. The killing was cold and irreversible. Biegenwald fled, but within days, he was captured after a shootout with police in Maryland. Extradited back to New Jersey, he was convicted of murder and sentenced to life in prison. For nearly 2 decades, he remained behind bars. Then, against public safety and logic, he was paroled in the mid-1970s. Once free, he kept a low profile, working odd jobs and blending into society. On the surface, he appeared calm. Underneath, the violence was only dormant. Within a few years, he became a suspect in a rape case and violated parole conditions, though he avoided conviction when the victim could not identify him. He married, moved to Asbury Park, and befriended a man named Darren Fitzgerald, unknowingly setting the stage for his most brutal period. In the early 1980s, bodies began appearing. One of the most haunting cases involved a young woman named Anna Olesiewicz, just 18 years old. She was last seen walking along the Asbury Park boardwalk, unaware that the man who approached her had killed before. Biegenwald lured her into his car and later shot her 4 times in the head. Her body was dumped in a wooded area behind a fast food restaurant in Ocean Township. Children later discovered her remains, fully clothed, with no signs of sexual assault, only execution-style wounds. The randomness of the killing made it even more terrifying. AS investigators dug deeper. More horror surfaced. Biegenwald was suspected in multiple other murders, including the killing of John Patrone, an ex-convict and police informant whose body was buried in a remote wildlife preserve, missing its jawbone. Another victim was a teenage girl named Virginia Clayton, abducted and murdered within days of Patrone's burial. The crimes were scattered, but the signature was the same: control, gunfire, disposal. The case finally broke open when police surrounded Biegenwald's home in early 1983. Using deception, officers lured him outside and arrested him. Inside the house, they discovered a nightmare: a hidden room filled with weapons, illegal drugs, pipe bombs, venomous animals, and detailed floor plans of local buildings. Fitzgerald, terrified, surrendered and agreed to cooperate. What he told police changed everything. He described bodies hidden in garages, buried in basements, and dumped in shallow graves. He led authorities to multiple burial sites, uncovering victims who had been missing for years. As the investigation expanded, a 9th victim was found, a prison escapee named William Ward, shot multiple times in the head and buried in Neptune City. Despite the overwhelming evidence, prosecutors could only formally charge Biegenwald with a limited number of murders. Fitzgerald testified against him, revealing the full extent of the violence that had gone unchecked for decades. In the end, Biegenwald was convicted of multiple first-degree murders, including those of Stephen Sladowski, Maria Chiolala, Deborah Osborne, Anna Olesiewicz, William Ward, and Betsy Bacon. Some victims he admitted to killing. Others he denied until his last days. He spent the remainder of his life in prison, dying in early March of the late 2000s from organ failure in a medical facility, far removed from the lives he destroyed. This case is not just the story of a serial killer. It is the story of warnings ignored, systems that failed, and a childhood that spiraled into unchecked brutality. From the first fire to the final grave, every stage showed what happens when violence is treated as a phase instead of a danger. If stories like this matter to you, if you believe patterns should never be ignored and victims should never be forgotten, then share your thoughts, stay aware, and remember, monsters are rarely born overnight. Case 3: The story begins far away from crime scenes and police tape, in a quiet town where nothing seemed out of place. Arthur Gary Bishop was born in late September of the early 1950s in Hinckley, Utah, the eldest of 6 boys in a family that had deep roots in the area. On the surface, his childhood appeared structured, religious, and disciplined. His parents were well known in the community, and their family history stretched back generations. Yet behind that stable image, Bishop later claimed that something inside him fractured at a very young age, long before anyone could see it. He would eventually admit that his earliest feelings of sexual arousal were tied to disturbing imagery from religious texts, a confession that hinted at a mind already forming dangerous associations between faith, control, and violence. As a child, Bishop stood out for all the wrong reasons and all the right ones. He was quiet, withdrawn, and often alone, but also exceptionally intelligent. He became an Eagle Scout, attended church faithfully, and was seen as devout and disciplined. Teachers described him as sharp, focused, and dependable. During his teenage years at Delta High School, he excelled academically, especially in business-related subjects. He was trusted with responsibility, elected as the school's business manager, and even chosen to speak at his graduation. To everyone watching, he looked like a young man destined for success, the kind parents point to as a role model. He carried that image into college, enrolling in a business and accounting program and earning praise for his academic performance. By his early 20s, he was recognized as an honors student with an impressive grade average. He then volunteered for missionary service overseas, representing his church in the Philippines. To his family and community, this was proof that Arthur Bishop was morally upright and spiritually committed. No one suspected that beneath the clean-cut appearance and religious devotion, his inner world was becoming darker and more dangerous. After returning to the United States, Bishop took a bookkeeping job at a car dealership. It was here that the cracks finally began to show. He was arrested for embezzlement and given a suspended sentence, a serious warning that should have stopped him. Instead, he ran. He violated parole, fled to Salt Lake City, and adopted a new identity, calling himself Roger Downs. Not long after, he was excommunicated from the church that had once trusted him completely. By this point, the life he presented to the world and the life he lived in secret were no longer aligned. In Salt Lake City, Bishop found access to children through a respected mentorship organization. For nearly a year, he acted as a trusted adult figure to young boys. Behind that trusted role, he was already crossing lines, exploiting access, and violating innocence. Program leaders eventually discovered troubling behavior and forced him out, but no criminal charges followed. Once again, the warning signs were acknowledged too late and acted on too weakly. His first known murder came shortly after. In mid-October of the late 1970s, Bishop lured a 4-year-old boy named Alonzo Daniels away from his apartment complex by promising candy. What followed was calculated and horrifying. Inside his apartment, Bishop killed the child and disposed of the body in a remote desert valley. What makes this crime especially chilling is what came after. He walked past the boy's frantic mother while carrying the child's body hidden in a box. In the months that followed, Bishop admitted he relived the experience through acts of extreme cruelty toward animals, a grim indication that the killing had not satisfied his urges, but strengthened them. More time passed, and Bishop refined his methods. He manipulated trust, used other children as intermediaries, and relied on lies that sounded harmless. In early November of the early 1980s, he targeted an 11-year-old boy named Kim Peterson. He arranged meetings under false pretenses, convinced the child to leave with him, and took him to the same isolated desert area. There, Bishop shot the boy from behind, and then again to ensure he was dead. He buried Kim near the grave of his first victim. Despite questioning by police, Bishop blended into the background. Witness descriptions were vague, and he did not stand out. Once again, he escaped suspicion. By the autumn of the early 1980s, Bishop struck again. This time, he abducted 4-year-old Danny Davis from a supermarket, taking him just a short distance to his home. When the child cried, Bishop panicked and suffocated him. The scale of the police response that followed was massive. Search teams flooded neighborhoods. Lakes were dredged, flyers were printed, and even hypnosis was used on witnesses. The entire community was desperate for answers. Yet Bishop remained invisible, living among them, watching the search unfold while knowing exactly where the body was hidden. After that murder, Bishop later claimed he told himself it would never happen again. For nearly 2 years, he did not kill. But the pause was not remorse. It was restraint. In late June of the early 1980s, on what should have been a child's birthday celebration, Bishop abducted 6-year-old Troy Ward. He handcuffed and restrained the boy in his basement and killed him there. This time, instead of burying the body in the desert, he disposed of it in a mountain stream, believing nature would erase his crime. Only weeks later, he killed again. A 13-year-old boy named Graham Cunningham trusted Bishop enough to get into his car, believing he was going on a harmless trip. Bishop lured him back to his home, struck him, drowned him, and disposed of the body the same way he had before. Then, chillingly, he went on a trip out of state as if nothing had happened. The investigation finally closed in around him when police noticed a pattern. Bishop lived near multiple abduction sites and had personal connections to families of the victims. When detectives brought him in for questioning under a false pretext, the pressure worked. He asked to return home and show them something. What officers found there exposed the full extent of his crimes. Hundreds of photographs, hidden albums, and evidence of widespread abuse revealed that the murders were only part of a much larger pattern. Bishop himself admitted that investigators had likely uncovered only a fraction of the children he had harmed. Once confronted with evidence and his true identity uncovered, Bishop confessed quickly. In less than an hour, he admitted to all 5 murders and led police to burial sites scattered across the desert. His explanation was cold and disturbingly simple. He said he killed to silence his victims and hide his abuse at a tea trial in the mid-1980s. Bishop spoke openly about his obsessions, blaming his descent on pornography and unchecked fantasy. The jury found him guilty on all major charges, and he was sentenced to death. When the sentence was read, he apologized to the families and requested execution by lethal injection. In letters written after his conviction, he described his mindset in chilling detail, explaining how his conscience had been numbed and how he had reduced children to objects rather than human beings. In early summer of the late 1980s, Arthur Gary Bishop was executed at a Utah state prison. He declined a final meal and again expressed remorse, offering apologies and prayers to the families whose lives he had shattered. His words, however sincere they sounded, came far too late. This case is not only about a serial killer. It is about how intelligence, religion, and respectability can hide extreme danger, and how repeated failures to act allowed a predator to continue for years. Every warning was there. Every sign was visible. But until the bodies were found, no one truly saw him. That if stories like this remind you why vigilance matters and why silence can be deadly, take a moment to reflect, share awareness, and remember the victims whose names must never be forgotten. Case 4 Terry Blair was born into a family already fractured by instability, violence, and untreated mental illness. He was the 4th eldest of 10 siblings, raised by a mother who struggled deeply with her mental health and had only completed the 9th grade. Education, stability, and emotional security were scarce, and the household was defined by chaos rather than care. Terry later became a father to 2 sons and eventually a grandfather to 2 grandsons. But long before that, the environment he grew up in had already planted the seeds of destruction. Crime was not an exception in the Blair family. It was a recurring pattern that repeated itself across generations, creating a legacy of violence that surrounded Terry from childhood and followed him into adulthood. The first major fracture in the family came on August 16, 1978, when Terry's mother, Janice Blair, shot and killed her common-law husband. The killing shocked the community, but ended quietly in the courts when Janice entered an Alford plea to second-degree murder. She avoided prison and was sentenced instead to 5 years of probation, with mandatory counseling, therapy, and psychiatric treatment. For Terry and his siblings, this moment normalized lethal violence inside the home. Just 6 months later, the family descended further into darkness when Terry's brother, Walter Blair Jr., was accused of killing 16-year-old Sandy Shannon during a robbery. Though Walter faced charges of capital murder, robbery, and assault, the case collapsed when witnesses refused to testify, allowing him to walk free. That freedom did not last long. On August 19, 1979, Walter Blair abducted 21-year-old Catherine Jo Allen, a young woman who was reportedly a witness in a rape case. According to investigators, Walter was paid $6,000 to kill her. He shot her to death, confessed to the murder, and later recanted his confession, but the evidence was enough to convict him. Walter Blair Jr. was sentenced to death for capital murder and was executed on July 21, 1993, at just 32 years old. By then, the Blair family name had already become synonymous with murder. Violence continued to ripple outward. Terry's sister, Warnetta Blair, became entangled in multiple homicide cases. In September 1980, She, her husband Noila White III, and another man were charged in the brutal murder of James L. Bell, whose body was discovered with 30 stab wounds. Warnetta initially agreed to testify against her husband in exchange for dropped charges, but state law prohibited spouses from testifying against one another. Eventually, Noila White III pleaded guilty to second-degree murder in 1984 and received a 12-year sentence. Years later, in a grim echo of the family cycle, he was murdered by his own son, Noila White IV, who pleaded guilty to second-degree murder in 2001 and was sentenced to 30 years in prison. But Warnetta's violence did not end there. In December 1989, she killed her boyfriend, Pablo P. Gomez, a Cuban drug dealer whose body was found bound and gagged. Prosecutors stated that Gomez had threatened to cut off her access to crack cocaine. Warnetta claimed she never intended to kill him and only tied him up to steal drugs and money. But after leaving him restrained, she and an accomplice reportedly told a neighbor they had messed up Pablo and spent the night smoking crack. In August 1990, she pleaded guilty to second-degree murder and was sentenced to 10 years, later being released in December 1999. That other siblings followed similarly violent paths. On June 25, 1992, Terry's older brother Clifford Miller abducted a woman, forced her to perform sexual acts in an abandoned house, then brutally beat her unconscious. Her injuries were catastrophic: a fractured skull, broken jaw, smashed cheekbones, and a gunshot wound so severe that doctors had to replace bone with metal. She remained hospitalized for more than 2 months. In 1994, Clifford was convicted of forcible sodomy, kidnapping, assault, and armed criminal action, receiving 2 life sentences plus an additional 240 years. That'd be why the late 1990s, even the next generation was entrenched in crime. Terry's brother Daniel was sentenced in December 1999 to more than 8 years in federal prison for dealing crack cocaine. Nephews faced murder, armed robbery, and firearm convictions, with some receiving life sentences plus decades more. Another nephew, William Blair, began his criminal career as a teenager and later went on a violent robbery spree involving threats, pistol whippings, and gunfire, resulting in dozens of felony convictions. This was the family environment in which Terry Blair lived, learned, and eventually killed. Terry Blair himself crossed the line in a murder in 1982 when he killed Angela Monroe, the mother of 2 of his children, who was pregnant at the time. According to court records, he was enraged by her involvement in prostitution. He was convicted and sentenced to 25 years in prison, serving 21 years before being released on parole. Despite the severity of the crime, his release placed him back into society with unresolved rage and violent compulsions that had never been addressed. In late summer of 2004, the consequences of that release became horrifyingly clear. On September 2, 2004, a neighbor near Prospect Avenue noticed a powerful odor coming from an abandoned home and discovered the decomposing bodies of 2 women inside the garage. The following night, an anonymous male caller contacted 911, calmly claiming responsibility for the murders and directing police to another body hidden in a nearby alley. On September 4th, the caller contacted dispatch again, revealing the locations of 2 more victims in an overgrown area near a highway and promising further calls. The calls abruptly stopped after a news station revealed details about the phone being used. As police searched the area, more bodies were uncovered, including one that had previously been ruled a drug overdose. Several women also came forward reporting rapes and assaults that appeared connected. All victims were found within a tight geographic radius, suggesting a killer who was deeply familiar with the neighborhood and confident enough to remain close to his crimes. Investigators soon focused on Terry Blair. He was on parole for murder, matched survivor descriptions, and had allegedly threatened to kill prostitutes. While police could not directly link him to the stolen phone used for the 911 calls, cell tower data placed the calls near his residence. He was arrested first for a parole violation and later formally charged. That on October 15, 2004, Blair was charged with 8 counts of first-degree murder, first-degree assault, and multiple rape charges. Prosecutors agreed not to pursue the death penalty if Blair waived a jury trial, leading to a bench trial overseen by Judge John O'Malley. Though much of the evidence was circumstantial, Blair's DNA was found on one victim, Shalia McKenzie. Linguistic experts testified that the voice on the 911 calls matched Blair's speech patterns. Despite his denials, the judge ruled the evidence overwhelming that on March 27, 2008, Terry Blair was found guilty of 6 murders and sentenced to 6 life terms without parole. He continued to deny responsibility until the end of his life, leaving investigators unable to fully understand his motive beyond what appeared to be a compulsive hatred toward women involved in prostitution. Terry Blair died in a prison hospital in Potosi, Missouri, on May 11, 2024, at the age of 62. His death closed a legal case, but not the emotional wounds left behind. His crimes, shaped by a lifetime surrounded by violence, left families grieving, communities scarred, and a chilling reminder of how cycles of brutality can span generations when never truly broken. Case 5. Levi Rabbits, who the world would later know as Stephen Belfield, entered the world on May 17, 1968, at the West Middlesex Hospital in Isleworth, Greater London. Born to Jean Rabbits and Joseph Belfield, Levi's early life was marked by both love and hardship, and his Romani heritage quietly shaped much of his identity. Yet, beneath the surface of a seemingly ordinary childhood, dark threads of tragedy were already weaving their way through his life. When Levi was just 10 years old, the unimaginable struck. His father succumbed to leukemia, leaving a void that would haunt him for years to come. Alongside his 2 brothers and 2 sisters, Levi grew up in the cramped and often unforgiving environment of a southwest London council estate, where childhood innocence collided with harsh realities. He walked the halls of Forge Lane Junior School, later Rectory Secondary, and finally Feltham Comprehensive, each step taking him deeper into a world that was slowly shaping his future in ways no one could yet foresee. As Levi grew into adulthood, his personal life took a turbulent path. He fathered 11 children with 5 different women, a chaotic web of relationships that mirrored the turmoil within him. The youngest 3 children were born to his most recent partner, Emma Mills, tying him to yet another chapter of complexity and emotional entanglement. Life, however, continued to twist in unexpected ways. In May 2022, it emerged that while confined behind the walls of prison, Belfield had sought something profoundly human, a chance at connection and companionship. The Ministry of Justice confirmed that he had become engaged, proposing to a woman who had first reached out to him through letters 2 years earlier, a connection that evolved into regular visits. The approval of such a union, however, rested on the discretion of the governor at HM Prison Franklin, adding yet another layer of tension and uncertainty to an already extraordinary story. But the twist didn't end there. By June 2023, Belfield had made another life-altering decision. He converted to Islam, adopting the name Yusuf Rahim. This transformation marked a startling shift, a redefinition of identity within the confines of prison walls, raising questions about redemption, faith, and a human desire for reinvention even amidst darkness. From a childhood shadowed by loss to a life riddled with complex relationships and dramatic choices behind bars, Belfield's story is a haunting reflection of how trauma, circumstance, and personal decisions intertwine to shape a life that is as compelling as it is unsettling. That Belfield's descent into a life of crime began early, long before the headlines and murder investigations. In 1981, as a child, he faced his first conviction for burglary, a moment that seemed minor at the time, but would foreshadow a pattern of lawlessness. By 1990, the stakes had escalated. He was convicted of assaulting a police officer, a stark glimpse of the violent impulses simmering beneath a seemingly normal exterior. Over the years, a trail of theft and driving offenses filled his record, and by 2002, Belfield had amassed 9 convictions and spent nearly a year behind bars. Detective Chief Inspector Colin Sutton of the Metropolitan Police, who would later lead the high-profile murder investigation, described him chillingly. When we started dealing with him, He came across as very jokey, like he's your best mate. But he's a cunning individual, violent. He can switch from being nice to being nasty instantly. That duality, the charming mask over a dangerous core, would define Belfield's terrifying approach to his victims. His hunting ground were the streets he knew intimately, the neighborhoods where he had grown up, worked, and driven his wheel-clamping business. Former girlfriends painted a disturbing, consistent portrait. He was lovely at first, charming, then completely controlling and evil, Detective Sergeant Joe Brunt recalled. They all said the same. Belfield's arrogance and need for control were palpable. Sutton speculated on the dark logic behind his attacks. Belfield, feeding his massive ego, viewed himself as untouchable, God's gift to everyone. When a young girl dared to reject him, a glance, a refusal, even crossing the street, his response was instant and brutal. The case of Kate Sheedy illustrated this pattern perfectly. She noticed his car, avoided eye contact, and in his mind, that act of defiance made her a target. The result was horrific, a sudden, violent attack that left a lasting scar on both the victim and the community. Under police surveillance, Belfield continued his predatory behavior, driving around in his van, stopping to speak to young girls at bus stops, blending normalcy with menace. CCTV footage of Amelie Delagrange, a young girl walking toward Twickenham Green after missing her bus stop, showed the quiet terror of chance meeting with a predator. She may have paused to speak to Belfield, a brief interaction that would soon turn deadly. Moments later, she was attacked, leaving investigators and the public stunned by the cold precision of his crimes. The manhunt escalated quickly. In the early hours of November 22, 2004, Belfield was arrested on suspicion of Delagrange's murder. Within days, the charges multiplied. On November 25th, he faced 3 counts of rape across Surrey and West London. By December 9, 2004, he was charged with assaulting a woman in Twickenham between 1995 and 1997 and was remanded in custody. But the investigation was far from over. Belfield was rearrested on March 2, 2006, this time facing charges for Delagrange's murder, the attempted murder of Kate Sheedy, and the attempted murder with grievous bodily harm of Irma Dragoshi. Finally, on May 25, 2006, the net of justice tightened further. Belfield was charged with the murder of Marcia McDonnell. Each arrest, each charge, unveiled another layer of his cunning, violent, and calculated nature. A predator operating in plain sight, leaving terror in his wake and a trail that police were racing to follow. The case of Millie Dowler shook a nation to its core. Amanda Jane Dowler, known to her friends as Millie, was just 13 years old when she vanished without a trace. On March 21, 2002, she left Walton-on-Thames railway station, heading home from school, never imagining that her life would be cut short in one of the most chilling ways imaginable. For 6 agonizing months, her family clung to hope, desperately searching, sending out pleas, and waiting for any sign that she might still be alive. That hope was shattered when her body was eventually discovered in Yateley Heath Woods. Yateley, a serene forest that had become the setting of an unimaginable tragedy. The investigation into Millie's disappearance and death took years, with detectives tirelessly piecing together fragments of evidence, following leads that often led to dead ends. It wasn't until August 2009, 7 years after Millie's disappearance, that a major breakthrough came. Surrey police submitted a detailed dossier to the Crown Prosecution Service, CPS, laying out compelling evidence that tied Stephen Belfield to her murder. The dossier painted a horrifying picture of a man capable of unimaginable cruelty, someone who had spent years hiding his dark impulses behind a facade of charm and normalcy. On March 30th, 2010, the authorities acted. Belfield was formally charged with the kidnapping and murder of Millie Dowler, a crime that had haunted the public imagination for nearly a decade. Alongside this, he faced charges for the attempted kidnapping of 12-year-old Rachel Cowles on March 20th, 2002, just a day before Millie's disappearance. Throughout his trial, Belfield remained cold and detached, refusing to give evidence and denying any involvement in Millie's death. But the evidence against him was overwhelming. An intricate web of forensic detail, witness testimony, and the careful work of detectives who refused to let a predator evade justice. Finally, on June 23, 2011, the truth was laid bare. A jury, after hours of deliberation and confronting the chilling facts of Belfield's crimes, convicted him of Millie Dowler's murder. The verdict sent ripples of relief, sorrow, and anger through the nation. Justice had been served, but at a devastating cost. Millie's life, so young and full of promise, had been stolen by a man whose calculated evil left a permanent scar on the community. Her story, and the relentless pursuit of justice, serves as a stark reminder of the darkness that can lurk behind a seemingly ordinary face, and the courage it takes to confront it. Marcia Louise McDonnell is one that highlights the terrifying randomness of Stephen Belfield's violence. Marcia, just 19 years old, was living her ordinary life in Hampton, unaware that tragedy was lurking nearby. On February 4, 2003, she stepped off the 111 bus from Kingston upon Thames at the stop on Percy Road, a mundane routine that would soon turn into a nightmare. Moments later, she was brutally attacked, struck over the head with a blunt instrument, an act of violence that seemed almost senseless in its suddenness. The assault left her gravely injured, and despite the desperate efforts of medical staff, she succumbed to her injuries 2 days later in hospital. The calculated nature of Belfield's actions became even more chilling in the aftermath. Only 6 days after Marcia's murder, he sold his Vauxhall Corsa, a car he had purchased just 5 months earlier for £6,000, for a mere £1,500, a transaction that suggested a cold, detached attempt to erase evidence or move on from the crime with ruthless efficiency. This seemingly small detail painted a disturbing picture of a man who could commit an unthinkable act of violence and then carry on with his life as if nothing had happened, leaving devastation and grief in his wake. That Marcia's murder, like so many others linked to Belfield, revealed the terrifying pattern of his predatory behavior. A combination of impulsive rage, meticulous planning, and a chilling disregard for human life. Each attack left a trail of pain, confusion, and unanswered questions, underscoring just how dangerous someone like Belfield could be when operating in the shadows of everyday life. The terrifying ordeal of Kate Sheedy highlights the cold, calculated nature of Stephen Belfield's attacks. On May 28, 2004, Kate, only 18 years old, was walking near an industrial estate in Isleworth when the unthinkable happened. Without warning, Belfield deliberately ran her over as she crossed the road, a shocking act of violence that turned an ordinary day into a nightmare. Her mother, witnessing the horrifying aftermath, immediately called for an ambulance, and Kate was rushed to hospital. She survived, but the attack left her with multiple serious injuries, forcing her to spend weeks recovering and grappling with the trauma of what had happened in the years that followed. Kate became a crucial voice in the pursuit of justice. Nearly 4 years later, she gave evidence against Belfield during his trial for her attempted murder. She vividly described the car used in the attack, a white people carrier with blacked-out windows and a broken wing mirror, details that would later prove vital. Investigators discovered that Belfield owned a Toyota Previa that perfectly matched her description at the time, linking him unmistakably to the crime. Kate's courage in speaking out, despite the fear and pain she endured, helped bring the truth to light. Her story is a chilling reminder of how calculated and dangerous Belfield was, striking without warning, yet also a testament to resilience in the face of trauma. The attack on Kate Sheedy stands as one of the most disturbing chapters in Belfield's long trail of violence, a vivid illustration of his ability to turn ordinary streets into hunting grounds, leaving terror and heartbreak in his wake. Amélie Delagrange adds another dark and haunting chapter to Stephen Belfield's trail of terror. Amélie, a 22-year-old French student, had come to England full of life and curiosity, exploring a country far from home. But on the evening of August 19, 2004, her visit turned into a nightmare. She was discovered at Twickenham Green, her body battered with serious head injuries, and despite being rushed to hospital, she tragically died that same night. The suddenness and brutality of her death sent shockwaves through the local community and left investigators scrambling for answers. Remarkably, within just 24 hours, police had begun to piece together a chilling connection. Amelie's murder bore disturbing similarities to the killing of Marcia McDonald, which had occurred only 18 months earlier. The patterns, the brutality, and the opportunistic targeting of young women all pointed to the same predator lurking in plain sight. As the investigation intensified, Belfield's dark persona came into sharper focus. Reports later revealed that he confessed to Amelie's murder while on remand, a chilling admission that confirmed the fears of detectives and horrified the public. That Amelie's story, like those of the other victims, underscores the terrifying precision of Belfield's attacks. His ability to blend into ordinary streets, strike without warning, and vanish into the shadows, leaving devastation behind. It is a stark reminder of the fragility of life when faced with a calculated and remorseless predator, and the lasting grief inflicted on families who lost loved ones in the most senseless ways imaginable. Stephen Belfield's criminal web was not limited to the murders that shocked the nation. His sinister reach extended to abduction and attempted murder as well. On October 14, 2001, Belfield was charged with the abduction and false imprisonment of Anna Maria Rennie, a 17-year-old girl in Witten. It was an attack that would haunt investigators for years, with Rennie later identifying him in a video identity parade 4 years after the incident, bringing another layer of accountability to his growing list of crimes. Belfield was also charged with the attempted murder of Irma Dragoshi, then aged 39, in Longford on December 16, 2003. Despite the severity of these allegations, the jury ultimately failed to reach a verdict on either charge, leaving the haunting question of what might have happened lingering in the shadows. Even more chilling is the possibility of additional victims whose lives were touched by Belfield's darkness. One of the earliest cases linked to him was the murder of Patricia "Patsy" Joyce Morris, a 14-year-old schoolgirl from Feltham, London, who vanished on June 16, 1980, during her lunch break. Believed to have returned home to change out of a wet raincoat, Patsy never made it back safely. 2 days later, on June 18th, her lifeless body was discovered by a police dog handler on Hounslow Heath, just a quarter of a mile from her home. She was strangled with a ligature, found fully clothed and face down in a copse, with no signs of sexual assault. The murder was both shocking and puzzling, leaving the community reeling. Decades later, in February 2008, police revealed that they were investigating a possible confession made by Belfield while on remand. He was said to have been obsessed with Patsy's murder at the time it occurred and remained fascinated by the unsolved case for years. Belfield had attended Feltham Comprehensive, the same school as Patsy, and the two had even been childhood acquaintances, possibly her boyfriend, a fact unknown to her family until it was uncovered during the investigation. Her sister reflected on the revelation. "We did not know him. It was a shock when we found out they knew each other. Friends told us about it. It is horrendous." The timeline is particularly chilling. Belfield would have been just 12 years old at the time of Patsy's murder, a year before his first conviction for burglary at age 13. Even then, he was notorious for truancy, often wandering the streets and frequenting Hounslow Heath, where Patsy's body would later be found. Witnesses and former partners noted a disturbing pattern in Belfield's behavior: a hatred of blonde women, a possible early obsession that may have begun with Patsy, who was herself blonde. Her father, George Morris, recalled a death threat call he had received at the time, later speculating that the boy behind it could very well have been Belfield. He's a local man, which is why it could be him. And it's terrifying to think that someone of 12 or 13 could have done it. Patsy Morris's murder is widely regarded as one of the earliest sparks of Belfield's violent tendencies, a horrifying glimpse into the darkness that would later engulf so many lives. Even at such a young age, the seeds of obsession, control, and brutality were already taking root, creating a pattern that would haunt the streets of London for decades to come. Even after his 2008 convictions, Stephen Belfield's shadow over London streets seemed far from fully revealed. Police began reviewing the murder of Judith Gold, a 51-year-old woman whose life had been abruptly and violently ended in Hampstead in October 1990. Judith, described as an attractive and vivacious middle-class housewife, was found dead just a yard from her home, struck multiple times in the face with an unidentified blunt weapon. Investigators soon suspected that Belfield could be linked to this murder, along with around 20 other unsolved attacks on women across London. A chilling pattern of brutality that spanned from 1990 to roughly 2004. Police analysis revealed that attacks using blunt force trauma on women and children with objects such as hammers were so rare that only a single unsolved incident in Greater London could possibly be ruled out as Belfield's work. The circumstances surrounding Judith Gould's murder were shrouded in mystery. On October 20th, 1990, she left her home above the Midland Bank in Hampstead High Street around 5:30 a.m., dressed as if for a business meeting, though she usually did not wake so early, and her work did not require her to be active on a Saturday. Just yards away, in Old Brewery Mews, a paperboy discovered her battered body, the surrounding streets unusually dark due to faulty street lighting. Astonishingly, no witnesses reported hearing screams or a struggle, and her housemates had not heard her leave the house in the early hours. Judith had been widowed for 2 years, living with her 19-year-old daughter and a family friend, yet no one could explain why she left at such an hour. Judith's life was far from ordinary. She worked as an insurance and mortgage agent, a freelance financier, and was also known professionally as Judith Silver. Her work was high-stakes and complex, negotiating large low-interest loans, and even becoming involved in an international advanced fee fraud scheme, which Scotland Yard initially speculated might have played a role in her death. Yet robbery seemed unlikely. Her handbag and jewelry were untouched, though her distinctive chain had been removed, a subtle, eerie detail suggesting that her murder was personal or symbolic rather than opportunistic. Investigators theorized that she might have arranged a meeting with someone she knew, as her car had been mysteriously reversed into its parking space the day before her death, something she never did herself. The lead detective later remarked in 1994, "We're sure she got in too deep, and that's what led to her death." Decades later, in February 2022, the case took a chilling turn. Belfield reportedly confessed to Judith Gould's murder while in custody. This revelation added another haunting chapter to his dark legacy, reinforcing the terrifying idea that for years, Belfield had prowled London streets, targeting women across generations and social classes, leaving devastation, mystery, and fear in his wake. Among the most controversial and debated chapters linked to Stephen Belfield are the 1996 murders of Lynn Russell, 45, and her 6-year-old daughter, Megan, in Chillenden, Kent. For years, these killings were attributed to Michael Stone, but Belfield's name has repeatedly surfaced in connection with the case, adding layers of mystery and speculation. According to reports, Belfield allegedly confessed to the murders to a fellow prisoner, providing chilling details that, it was claimed, would only be known by the killer. Yet, Belfield himself denied making any confession, leaving investigators and the public to grapple with uncertainty. In 2017, a BBC Two program, The Chillenden Murders, re-examined the evidence with independent experts and suggested that Belfield should be investigated further for these crimes. Meanwhile, Stone's legal team maintained that Belfield was in fact the true perpetrator. However, a potential alibi complicated matters. In December 2017, the Sunday Times reported that Belfield's ex-wife, Johanna Collings, had told investigators during the Delagrange case that he had spent her 25th birthday entirely with her in Twickenham and Windsor, over 100 miles away from Kent, where the murders occurred around 4:30 p.m. Her testimony was deemed credible by detectives, and she emphasized her certainty in a BBC documentary in 2017. "My daughter was born in '96, and that was the day of my birthday. He never left my side, all day and all night. So there's absolutely no way he could have got from Twickenham to Kent, done what they say he did, and got back without me not knowing he was there. I can hand on my heart, he didn't do it." Her statement highlighted the conflicting narratives surrounding Belfield's possible involvement, showing how even those closest to him were caught in the tension between suspicion and truth. Despite the alibi, The story resurfaced in February 2022 when Stone's lawyer, Paul Bacon, claimed that Belfield had signed a 4-page confession detailing the murders of Lynn and Megan Russell with information allegedly known only to the killer. Yet further scrutiny cast doubt on its validity. Belfield's ex-wife's earlier testimony remained a strong counterpoint, and a member of Stone's legal team later acknowledged that the so-called confession contained nothing beyond publicly available details, suggesting it may have been fabricated. Even Detective Chief Inspector Colin Sutton, who had investigated Belfield's other crimes, cautioned the media, "Knowing Belfield as I do, this could be him playing mind games." Metropolitan Police investigations had previously found no evidence linking Belfield to the Russell murders, reinforcing the idea that the claims remained unproven. The saga continued into 2023, when Belfield's lawyer claimed that he had admitted to the murders in a conversation with a prison psychologist, and Stone's legal team submitted a signed confession to the CCRC. In July 2023, the CCRC initially decided not to refer the case to the Court of Appeal, but just 3 months later, the decision was overturned, prompting a review of Stone's conviction based on the new evidence. The Russell murders remain one of the most complex and debated threads in the story surrounding Belfield, a chilling reminder of how his name continues to haunt unsolved cases, blurring the lines between fact, allegation, and speculation, and leaving the public questioning whether justice has truly been served. Even decades after his initial convictions, Stephen Belfield's name continued to surface in shocking new allegations. In October 2022, police were informed that Belfield had reportedly confessed to the abduction, rape, and murder of 19-year-old Elizabeth Chow, who had vanished years earlier, and to the attempted murders of 5 other women. Elizabeth Chow disappeared in West London on April 16, 1999, leaving her home in West Ealing at noon to attend Thames Valley University. She was last seen that evening by a friend at Ealing Broadway at 5:50 p.m., and from that moment, her family endured years of uncertainty and fear. The alleged confession by Belfield did not come to light until April 2023, and he was not formally interviewed regarding the murder until May, when he claimed in a recorded session that he had abducted and killed Elizabeth, even pointing investigators to the location of her supposed burial on a map. The family, frustrated and grieving, publicly criticized the Metropolitan Police, accusing them of failing to take the case seriously due to Chow's race, adding a further layer of tension and heartbreak to an already tragic story. After months of meticulous investigation, the Metropolitan Police reached a firm conclusion in November 2023. Belfield was not responsible for Elizabeth Chow's disappearance. While he had claimed to have waited for her in his car near Ealing Police Station, CCTV footage from that night showed no sign of him or his vehicle, undermining his confession. Consequently, authorities decided not to excavate the site where he had alleged he had buried her. Though this chapter of Belfield's story ultimately led to a dead end, it highlights the persistent fear and speculation that surrounded his name and the devastating way his legacy of terror continued to cast a shadow over families desperate for answers. The terrifying reach of Stephen Belfield extended even to those who miraculously survived his attacks. In January 2004, 23-year-old Sarah Spurl was walking alone in a dark street in Hastings, East Sussex, when Belfield struck her 3 times with a hammer. The assault could have ended in tragedy, but thanks to the quick intervention of a bystander, Sarah survived. She bravely reported the attack to the police, only to be told, according to her, that the authorities lacked the resources to investigate. She later described the response as dismissive, saying she felt the police considered her case an utter joke. Nearly 2 decades later, in March 2023, Belfield, long known as a convicted murderer and predator, reportedly confessed to the attack on Spurl, along with several other attempted murders and assaults. Shockingly, Sarah was not informed directly by law enforcement. Instead, she learned of his confession through journalists from ITV News, leading her to publicly criticize the police for their lack of transparency and sensitivity in handling such a deeply personal revelation. Belfield's web of confessions continued to unravel over the years. In early 2015, Authorities were informed that while in his cell at HM Prison Wakefield, he had allegedly admitted to unsolved rape and murder cases, prompting the Metropolitan Police to coordinate investigations across 10 separate police forces. On November 9, 2016, police issued a formal statement. All lines of inquiry have now been exhausted, and the decision has been taken to close this investigation as there is no evidence to link the individual to any case for which he has not already been convicted. Later revelations suggested a darker, psychological motive behind some of Belfield's confessions. Investigators believe that he may have fabricated admissions of other murders purely to inflict emotional pain on the families of victims, demonstrating a chilling manipulativeness and continuing cruelty even from behind bars. The case of Sarah Spurl and these subsequent confessions underscore the profound and lingering impact of Belfield's crimes, not just on his victims, but on communities, law enforcement, and anyone caught in the orbit of his terror. After a trail of terror that left London and its surrounding areas in fear for decades, Stephen Belfield was finally brought to justice. On February 25, 2008, he was found guilty of the murders of Marcia McDonnell and Amelie Delagrange, as well as the attempted murder of Kate Sheedy, more than 3 years after the last of these attacks. The very next day, he was sentenced to life imprisonment with a whole life order, meaning he would never be released. In a defiant and chilling move, Belfield refused to attend court, claiming that the press coverage following his conviction was unfair, showing the same arrogance and detachment that had marked his crimes. The shadow of Belfield's crimes did not end there. On March 30th, 2010, he was charged with the abduction and murder of 13-year-old Millie Dowler, an attack that predated the earliest of his previously convicted crimes by almost a year. Authorities had named him as the prime suspect almost immediately after his first trial in 2008, prompting the inquest into Dowler's death to be adjourned. By October 6, 2010, Belfield appeared via video link in court and was formally charged with attempted abduction, actual abduction, and murder. His second trial began at the Old Bailey on May 10, 2011, with the nation watching closely. On June 23rd, the jury delivered its verdict. Belfield was guilty of Millie Dowler's murder, and the following day, he was sentenced once again to life imprisonment with a whole life order, cementing his place as one of the UK's most notorious criminals. Another case against him, involving the attempted abduction of an 11-year-old girl in Walton, had to be abandoned due to newspapers publishing prejudicial material, a frustrating reminder of the delicate balance between justice and media freedom. Even years later, Belfield continued to be linked to his crimes. On January 27, 2016, Surrey police announced that he had admitted for the first time abducting, raping, and murdering Millie Dowler during an interview about a possible accomplice. Belfield later denied ever making such a confession, yet authorities stood by their statement, highlighting the continued ambiguity and psychological games that surrounded him. As of 2020, Belfield remained incarcerated in HM Prison Franklin in County Durham, behind bars for life. The investigation and manhunt that ultimately led to Belfield's arrest have since been dramatized in multiple television series, reflecting the national fascination with his crimes. In early 2019, ITV aired a 3-part series, Manhunt, adapted from a memoir of Detective Chief Inspector Colin Sutton, with Martin Clunes portraying Sutton. The series traced the painstaking process of identifying, tracking, and arresting Belfield. The Crime and Investigation Channel also commissioned Making a Monster, with the 3rd episode focusing entirely on Belfield's character and motivations. Later, in 2021, Sky Crime aired The Real Manhunter, exploring the investigation from Sutton and his team's perspective, from Belfield's identification to arrest, trial, and conviction. These dramatizations have offered the public a detailed insight into the terrifying crimes and the relentless detectives who finally brought one of the UK's most notorious killers to justice. Case 7 on the morning of May 31st, 1925, as I reported for duty at Division 4 Station House on Lagrange Street, Boston, I was confronted with a scene that would haunt me for years. A young bellboy from the nearby Hotel Roland, normally lively and full of chatter, appeared at the door pale as a sheet, his hands trembling violently, his voice barely more than a whisper as he blurted out that something terrible had happened at Hotel Hollis. I immediately called for a patrolman to accompany me and, following the boy through the bustling streets of Boston, approached the hotel with a growing sense of dread. At the entrance, we were met by the room clerk and the manager, James Reagan, both looking ashen and unnerved, their usual composure shattered by fear. Stepping inside, the air seemed heavier, almost suffocating, and what I saw moments later caused my stomach to churn and my pulse to quicken. The scene was gruesome, chaotic, and unlike anything I had previously encountered in my years of investigating the city's crimes. Despite decades on the force, having seen robberies gone wrong, violent assaults, and strange deaths, the mystery unfolding within those walls was of a different order. Dark, puzzling, and terrifyingly deliberate. It was the beginning of what would become known as the Hotel Hollis mystery, a case that would test every ounce of skill, patience, and nerve I possessed, stretching over days filled with secrecy, conflicting accounts, and the grim task of piecing together a puzzle that seemed designed to elude capture. The tension, the whispers of witnesses, and the eerie quiet of the hotel's corridors all combined to create an atmosphere thick with fear and uncertainty, signaling that the events about to unravel were not mere misfortune or accident, but a calculated and chilling act that would leave a mark on Boston's history and on all of us tasked with uncovering the truth. After a few quick questions, I had gathered enough to instruct the accompanying officer to secure the hotel and hold all employees and guests in place, ensuring that nothing would be disturbed before the investigation began. I made my way up the narrow stairwell to room 406, where a cluster of frightened hotel staff and visitors lingered in the hallway, their faces pale and eyes wide with terror. Stepping inside the room, a cold, heavy silence settled over me, broken only by the faint rustle of disturbed bedding. On the bed lay the body of a woman, face down, her arms pulled tightly behind her back and bound with strips torn from the very sheets she had lain upon. The bedding was tangled and wrinkled, evidence of a violent struggle born of desperation and fear. Her nightdress, torn at the seams, revealed dark bruising and scratches on her neck, and a smear of blood ran from her mouth onto the pillow into which her face had been pressed with shocking force. The air felt heavier as I reached out to touch her. The body was ice cold, and in that instant, I knew she had been dead for hours. Murder was no longer a suspicion, it was a fact. And while my duty was to uncover the person responsible for this cruel act, I also knew that every detail of the scene had to remain untouched, every clue preserved until the medical examiner arrived. For even a single misstep could mean the difference between solving the crime and allowing the killer to slip through our fingers. That I picked up the telephone and sent a brief, urgent report to the station house, making sure they understood the gravity of the situation and arranged for Inspector James A. Dennessy, head of the homicide squad at headquarters, to be notified immediately. Without a moment's hesitation, I called the district medical examiner, Dr. Timothy Leary, explaining the circumstances with as much clarity as I could muster over the line. Officers were dispatched hastily from the station, moving with the urgency that only a confirmed murder scene could demand, while I ensured that everyone in the hotel, staff and guests alike, was held in place under strict supervision. The corridors, once lively with hotel activity, now felt tense and claustrophobic, thick with fear and anticipation. As I waited for Dr. Leary and Inspector Dennessy, who arrived shortly after, accompanied by a police stenographer to record every observation, I began piecing together the initial facts, scanning the room for signs of struggle, noting every disarrayed chair, every smear of blood, and the terrified expressions of those gathered in the hallway, knowing that each detail could become a crucial clue in unraveling the mystery of the Hotel Hollis murder. The victim was soon identified as Mrs. May Pryor, the wardrobe mistress of the Brown Derby Theatrical Company, which had concluded its run at a Boston theater the previous evening. It was now Sunday morning, and the usually bustling hotel was eerily quiet. Mrs. Pryor had retired to her room alone sometime around midnight, or shortly thereafter, intending to catch the noon train to New York with other members of the troupe. That morning, when repeated telephone calls to her room went unanswered, concern began to ripple through the hotel staff. A bellboy was dispatched to wake her, only to find the door slightly ajar. Peering inside, he was confronted with a scene so horrifying that fear rooted him to the spot for a heartbeat before he bolted, racing back to the hotel desk to raise the alarm, and then sprinting straight to the police station to summon me. The speed and panic in his footsteps were matched only by the dread settling in my chest, for I knew instinctively that the violence contained within that room would prove far more than an ordinary crime. It would be a chilling puzzle that would test every ounce of skill, patience, and resolve I possessed as a detective. The pillow bore a deep, sinister indentation, a grim testament to the force with which Mrs. Pryor's face had been pressed into it, leaving a silent but unmistakable mark of the struggle she had endured. The blankets, still rumpled across the mattress, suggested the room had been disturbed in a violent, deliberate act, and it soon became apparent how cunning the perpetrator had been. The murderer had hidden beneath the bed, lying in wait for Mrs. Pryor to return and settle into sleep, stalking her with a patience both calculated and chilling. Every detail of the scene spoke of premeditation. The quiet of the room, the stillness of the furniture, the shadows under the bed, all orchestrated so that the attack could be carried out with maximum surprise and terror. It was a level of cold-blooded planning that made the hair on the back of my neck rise, and in that moment, it was clear that the Hotel Hollis crime was not a random act, but the work of someone who had studied, anticipated, and waited for the perfect opportunity to strike. The cool, methodical, and highly experienced Dr. Timothy Leary began his careful examination, moving with a confidence born of years of confronting death and violence. His eyes swept over the scene and the body with astonishing precision, seemingly noting every detail at a glance. "She certainly put up a good fight," he remarked quietly, his tone carrying both respect for the victim and a chilling acknowledgement of the savagery of the crime. As he turned the body over, the grim reality of the attack became clear. The woman's face and chest bore evidence of a ferocious beating. Several ribs were fractured, and wide, dark bruises encircled her throat. Her protruding tongue confirmed the horror. She had been strangled with deliberate force. Examining the marks on the throat with a practiced eye, Dr. Leary made a pointed observation. "Look for a person with unusually large hands." It was the first tangible clue to the identity of the perpetrator, a thread that could begin to unravel the mystery. Then came an even more startling discovery. Under the victim's well-manicured fingernails were tiny fragments of human skin and dried blood, a clear sign of a desperate struggle in the final moments of her life. Later laboratory analysis would confirm the significance of these findings. In that moment, the case gained direction and urgency. We now had two critical pieces of evidence. The murderer likely had fresh scratches on their face or hands, and their hands were unusually large, a detail that might allow us to narrow the suspect pool considerably. The combination of brutality and precision suggested a predator both cunning and strong, and every officer and investigator in that room felt the chilling weight of the challenge ahead. To track down a criminal capable of such calculated violence before they struck again to misses. Pryor's clothing, toiletries, and personal belongings lay scattered about the room exactly as she had left them, a quiet testimony to the ordinary life that had been so violently interrupted. Near the bureau on the polished floor, a small envelope, the type used for wages, had one end torn off and dropped carelessly nearby. It was empty. In a small box, we discovered a similar envelope, this one still holding a $5 bill and some loose change, suggesting that theft, if it was the motive, had been haphazard or secondary to something darker. Remarkably, the only clear signs of struggle were confined to the bed, indicating that the assailant had either caught her off guard while she slept or that some other cunning method had been used to control and overpower her. The bellboy who had sounded the alarm around 9:30 that morning insisted he found the door slightly ajar, a detail that now hinted at chilling possibilities. Had the murderer been someone Mrs. Pryor trusted, someone permitted into her room after she retired for the night? Or was this a crime driven by jealousy, revenge, or some other sinister motive we had yet to uncover. Each theory weighed heavily on us, for the scene offered little concrete evidence beyond the obvious brutality, leaving the investigation suspended between fear, conjecture, and the grim reality that the perpetrator was likely still unknown, and possibly still at large. Beneath the bed, I noticed a partly smoked cigarette, its faint ash a silent witness to the presence of someone who had lingered in the room, perhaps hidden and waiting for the precise moment to strike. The thought sent a chill down my spine. Had the murderer waited under that very bed, watching, calculating, ready to seize the opportunity to commit such a brutal act? There was no room for error now. Every person in the hotel was questioned thoroughly before being allowed to leave, and though some guests grumbled and protested at the confinement, we had no intention of risking the escape of the killer, who had already demonstrated both cunning and ruthlessness. Members of the Brown Derby Company were tracked down, some staying at other hotels, while the manager of the troupe was registered at the Arlington Hotel. Each one was rounded up and interrogated, their alibis carefully noted and cross-checked. Despite exhaustive questioning, no one admitted seeing anyone enter or leave room 406 between the time Mrs. Pryor retired for the night and the discovery of her body by the bellboy the following morning. Likewise, no witness reported hearing any sounds from the struggle that had left the room in such disarray. No screams, no movements, nothing to betray the horror that had taken place sometime after midnight and before 2 a.m. The medical examiner confirmed what we had feared. Mrs. Pryor had died around 2 o'clock in the morning, her life extinguished in the quiet darkness while the hotel slept, leaving only questions, clues, and the urgent task of catching a brutal and patient murderer before he could strike again. The condition of Mrs. Pryor's body, combined with the mute testimony of the rumpled bed, screamed the story of a desperate struggle for life, a fight she had undoubtedly waged with every ounce of strength. She possessed, yet, in an almost unfathomable twist, none of the guests in the adjoining rooms, nor any of the hotel staff, had heard a sound to arouse suspicion. No screams, no scuffle, nothing to betray the violent act that had taken place in the quiet hours of the night. It was as if the room had swallowed the horror, leaving only the silent evidence behind. In the midst of this grim scene, we uncovered something that seemed to strengthen the theory of robbery. The show manager informed us that the torn envelope had contained $80, Mrs. Pryor's pay from the previous evening. But there was more. Members of the theatrical company described Mrs. Pryor as the mother of the troupe, a guiding figure who managed small sums of money for the younger girls. One of the cast, a Jewish boy, had entrusted her with $60 for safekeeping, a testament to the trust she had earned. All told, it appeared Mrs. Pryor had been carrying roughly $200 in cash. And yet, in her room, we had found only a single $5 bill and some loose change, leaving a stark question hanging over the investigation. Had the motive truly been greed? And if so, where had the rest of the money gone? And who had taken it? Every detail deepened the mystery, heightening the urgency to uncover the person capable of such calculated violence and cunning theft. One figure, in particular, began to stand out in my mind, the young man who had entrusted Mrs. Pryor with $60 for safekeeping. He spoke of her not merely with respect, but with genuine affection, insisting she had cared for him like a mother and that his feelings for her were those of a devoted son. At the same time, another detail drew our attention. The victim's husband, a stage carpenter named Bill Pryor, employed in New York City at a theater near Broadway and 91st Street. We immediately relayed this information to the New York Police Department, requesting that he be located and gently informed of the tragedy that had struck his wife. Before long, word came back. Bill Pryor had been working late in a Saturday night, nearly until midnight, a fact that placed him far from Boston at the estimated time of death. The news of his wife's murder hit him like a physical blow, and arrangements were made for him to travel to Boston on the first train Monday morning to both identify the body and assist in any way he could with the investigation. When I met him, I took to him instantly. His grief was raw, unmistakable, and deeply human. He was a broken man, struggling to comprehend how his wife's life had ended in such horror. and while my instincts never allow sentiment to cloud judgment, I could not help but feel profound sympathy for him. Still, despite all the questioning, all the faces studied, and all the facts gathered, nothing yet had carried me closer to the moment I longed for most. The moment when the truth would finally snap into focus, and I could close the steel of handcuffs around the wrists of the person responsible for this cold-blooded crime. Days slipped by, each one stretching longer than the last, and despite the flurry of activity, the police investigation seemed to stall, trapped in a web of dead ends and false leads. Inspectors from headquarters, plainclothes detectives, an army of reporters, and a host of other curious and concerned parties scoured Boston for clues, turning over every stone, questioning anyone who might have passed near Hotel Hollis that fateful night. Dozens of alleged leads were submitted, yet after painstaking examination, each proved worthless, dissolving like smoke into the cold morning air. Anonymous letters flooded in, pointing fingers at this person or that, naming several South End characters who were supposedly the elusive killer. Every tip was investigated, every name checked and rechecked, yet one by one, each trail ended in utter emptiness. As weeks passed, inspectors were gradually reassigned to other cases, leaving me alone to persist in the search. Day and night, I worked, retracing steps through the hotel, revisiting statements, examining evidence, and racking my brain for some breakthrough that would unlock the mystery. What had initially seemed like an ordinary, almost routine case had morphed into a relentless puzzle, teasing me with its silence and its shadows. Nothing seemed to budge. The crime refused to yield its secrets, leaving me with only the growing sense that the murderer was still out there, patient, cunning, and waiting, while the city watched and wondered who could commit so calculated and horrifying an act. It's just one of those cases that can't be solved, an inspector remarked to me, a comment that lingered in my mind like a shadow, challenging me to prove him wrong. I spend hours pacing the corridors and public spaces of Hotel Hollis, speaking with every guest who remained, questioning the employees, and observing everything with a detective's eye, convinced that the crucial clue I was seeking was hiding somewhere in plain sight. Some of the people who had been present the night Mrs. Pryor was murdered might have been, to say the least, quite startled if they realized how much seemingly casual information I had quietly collected during my meticulous inquiries. On Tuesday, June 2nd, one detail in particular caught my attention. A theatrical man, staying in room 606 with his wife, had hosted a birthday party after the performance on the evening of May 30th. Merrymaking with friends at the very moment when, just 2 floors below, Mrs. Pryor had been fighting for her life in room 406. I meticulously tracked down everyone who had attended the celebration and interviewed each one, hoping against hope that some fleeting observation, an overheard sound, a forgotten movement might provide the slender thread I needed to pull this case together. The host of the party told me of an odd occurrence that had taken place that night, an incident apparently unrelated to the murder. Yet in a case this confounding, even the most trivial detail could hold unexpected significance, a hidden clue waiting to be recognized. The birthday party host explained that, after ushering his friends into his room following the evening's theater performance, he had left his room key on the corridor side of the lock. Later, as he and his wife were preparing to retire for the night, he discovered the key was missing. Assuming it had simply fallen somewhere, he surmised that a courteous stranger or hotel guest might have picked it up and turned it in at the front desk. In the meantime, he secured the door with the inside bolt, and when he reported the missing key to the room clerk on Sunday morning, it had yet to be recovered. The hotel provided him with a duplicate, but the incident left a small, nagging question in the back of my mind. Could this seemingly minor occurrence somehow connect to the more sinister events that had unfolded that night? Meanwhile, the only guest who offered anything resembling a suspicious sighting was Miss Mae Jensen, a vaudeville actress staying on the top floor. She recounted that around midnight, as she made her way down the corridor to borrow a razor from a friend, she was confronted by a large, rough-looking man in the hallway. At first, she assumed him to be a typical would-be masher, one of those men who accost women in public spaces. But there was something in the man's manner, something cold and deliberate, that sent a shiver down her spine. Fear overtook her, and she retreated quickly back in her room, bolting the door behind her. While her room was on the top floor and Mrs. Pryor's room lay on the fourth floor, the incident was too significant to ignore. The presence of a potentially dangerous stranger wandering the hallways that night could not be dismissed, even if it seemed at first glance only a remote thread in the larger, chilling tapestry of the Hotel Hollis mystery. To BY Saturday afternoon, June 6th. I felt the investigation had reached a frustrating dead end. Every room in the hotel had been combed for evidence. Every guest and employee questioned until their patience had run thin, yet the murder of Mrs. Pryor remained unsolved. Room 406, the scene of the crime, had undergone the most meticulous search for fingerprints and other physical clues, but nothing of value had turned up. No trace of the perpetrator, no lingering mark to guide us closer to the killer. I decided it was time to try a different tack, to venture beyond the confines of the hotel and the familiar faces of its occupants. Perhaps, I thought, one of the less savory characters who frequented the district might hold a lead, some sliver of information overlooked by the more conventional lines of inquiry. It was a long shot, maybe 1,000 to 1, but the case had been growing increasingly discouraging, and I was prepared to chase even the most improbable thread. If the motive had indeed been robbery, the murderer would have made off with roughly $200, a substantial sum that might suddenly reveal itself in the hands of a streetwise character whose recent affluence seemed unusual or out of place. It was then that I spotted a young man I knew well, lingering near the hotel. He was a struggling actor, one of those perpetual hopefuls whose presence was more familiar in the underworld haunts than on the stage, mingling with the shadier elements of the district, the sort of company that often carried more secrets than paychecks. His appearance and associations made him a prime candidate to be questioned, a potential window into the darker currents running beneath the theater district, and perhaps, just perhaps, a lead that could finally crack open the mystery that had haunted the halls of Hotel Hollis for nearly a week. "I want to see you," I said firmly, watching him closely. "Meet me on Dillaway Street in 10 minutes. Be there, and don't be late." I didn't allow myself to believe he would actually show, but I knew there was no point in trying to extract anything from him on the main street, where his peers, his gang, could easily spot him and assume the worst, that he had turned stool for the police. I noticed the young man shifting nervously, edging away as if trying to melt into the crowd. Fear radiated from him. He didn't want anyone watching, didn't want his reputation among his questionable friends to be questioned. I kept my tone low, casual and friendly, speaking in a way that seemed like idle conversation, as if we were just passing the time of day, masking the sharpness of my real intent. 10 minutes later, I made my way down Dillaway Street, a narrow, quiet side lane that offered cover and privacy. There he was, huddled in a doorway, shadowed from view, waiting. His posture was tense, alert, and yet reluctant, as if part of him already feared what the meeting might bring. I stepped closer, my eyes locked on his, my voice calm, but unyielding. "I've always been straight with you," I said, cutting through the hesitation. "Now tell me the truth. Who bumped off that woman in Hotel Hollis?" The silence stretched, charged with tension, the night air thick with anticipation. Every second passed felt like an eternity, as though the answer to a crime that had baffled the city for days might finally slip through the thin barrier of fear from his lips to mine. After a tense pause, the young man finally spoke, almost blurting the words out before he could second-guess himself. "Look for that big gorilla who's been hanging around the hotel all last week," he said, his voice low and wary that I leaned closer, fixing him with a steady gaze. "Who is he? Where does he hang out?" I pressed, trying to gauge whether this was a lead or just idle chatter. "I don't know anything about him," he admitted, shrugging, eyes flicking nervously down the street as though the shadows themselves might overhear. "How do you know this gorilla did it?" I demanded, my tone firm but controlled. "I don't," he stammered. "You wanted the office, so this was the first thing that popped into my head. I thought maybe it would help." I narrowed my eyes, sensing he might be holding back. "Who have you seen this big gorilla talking with? Come on, you must have seen him speak to somebody." "Who?" "Well," he said, pausing as he searched his memory. "I remember one night last week, I saw him stop and speak to a man I know. right there in front of the hotel. It was Benny Peretti. He was doing a turn at the theater here until Thursday. Now he's down in Newport, Rhode Island, but he's been commuting back and forth to Boston. The information hit me like a bolt of lightning. Finally, a name, a person connected to the area and to the theater crowd, someone whose movements could be traced, someone who might just lead me straight to the killer. It wasn't the whole answer, but it was the thread I'd been waiting for, the fragile, trembling line that could unravel the tangled knot of murder at Hotel Hollis. The tip was thin, almost threadbare, but I couldn't afford to ignore a single lead. Desperation sharpened my focus, and I threw myself into tracking down Benny Peretti. I discovered he was staying at the new Tremont House and typically arrived there around midnight, though I was told that before leaving for Newport, he might be seen lingering around Boston Common. I scoured the streets of Boston, searching in vain, until finally I decided to stake out the new Tremont House. Waiting for him to return, late that night, he arrived with his partner, moving through the lobby with a casual air, unaware that his steps were being watched. I knew I needed a private conversation, one away from prying eyes and ears, so I arranged for him to meet me at the police station on LeGrand Street at 7:15 the following morning. The rest of the night, I spent prowling the city, trying to gather anything I could about the mysterious figure described to me as the Big Gorilla, the shadowy presence whose involvement might finally crack the case. Benny Peretti arrived promptly at the station, his expression cautious but cooperative. Under questioning, he admitted he indeed knew the man I was describing. He explained that on the evening of Memorial Day, the fellow had approached him and attempted to borrow money, a seemingly innocuous interaction that now, in hindsight, might be the subtle thread connecting him to the horrific murder at Hotel Hollis. Every word Benny spoke was a key, a small piece of the puzzle, bringing the shadows in that hotel corridor one step closer to the light, and the killer one step nearer to justice. I was with a few fellows in front of Hotel Hollis. Benny Peretti began cautiously, his eyes darting as if the shadows themselves might overhear. I don't know the man's name. I only know him by sight. I pressed him further, my voice calm but insistent. Where did you first meet him? How did you come to know him? Benny hesitated, then began to explain. It was once when I was performing a show for the prisoners at the federal penitentiary in Leavenworth. They called him the Wop there. Something about that didn't sit right with me. I leaned in, my gaze sharp, and pressed Benny harder. Finally, he confessed that he, too, had been a prisoner when he met this imposing figure, the man he had come to know only as the Wop. The story that emerged was tangled with youthful misfortune and bureaucratic cruelty. Benny and his stage partner were just two young, ambitious men trying to make a mark on the world when they stumbled into trouble. By mistake, an express company delivered a trunk to their room, a trunk that belonged to someone else. Afraid of the consequences, the boys didn't report the error, and when the mistake was discovered, they were arrested and prosecuted in the United States court because the trunk had crossed state lines, making it a federal matter. With no money for a lawyer and inexperienced in the ways of the law, the frightened pair pleaded guilty, believing it might spare them from a harsher fate. Instead, they were sentenced to terms at Leavenworth, their brief brush with freedom replaced by the cold walls of a federal penitentiary. This encounter, I realized, was more than just a prison story. It was the thread that linked Benny, the district, and the shadowy figure of the Big Gorilla, whose dark presence had haunted Hotel Hollis. Every detail now seemed to point toward a man who had walked among ordinary lives, masked by the ordinary, yet capable of extraordinary violence. Benny Peretti described the man he knew only as the Wop, a figure whose very presence seemed to carry menace. He said the man had been incarcerated at Leavenworth, but was such a hopeless actor in prison performances that he was kept locked up most of the time, hidden from public view and largely forgotten by those around him. Yet Benny's memory carried one vivid incident. The Wop, he recounted, once escaped from Leavenworth by crawling through a sewer pipe, a daring feat that shocked everyone when he was finally captured and returned just a few days later. After that, Benny had heard nothing of the man, until a week ago, when the ex-convict suddenly approached him on the street, brazenly asking for money, a chilling reminder that the shadows of the past had a way of reaching forward into the present. Wasting no time, Superintendent of Police Michael Crowley dispatched a special delivery letter to Leavenworth, requesting a photograph and all available records of the prisoner who had pulled off the audacious sewer escape. The case had reached a crucial point. The identity of a dangerous ex-convict might finally be revealed, a man who could be tied to the murder at Hotel Hollis. While waiting for the reply, I continued to push the investigation with every ounce of energy I had. I scoured the streets, questioned witnesses, and retraced every step the killer might have taken. But no other leads presented themselves. The city felt tense, expectant, as if it, too, knew that the key to solving this grim and baffling crime was slowly, inevitably, making its way to the surface. Finally, on June 14th, the awaited response arrived, the breakthrough that could change everything. The letter from Leavenworth arrived like a key sliding into a lock, revealing that the man known as the WAP was in fact a hardened criminal named Frank Corey, who had served a long sentence for robbery. Holding the photograph in my hands, I felt the weight of the moment, the first tangible glimpse of a shadowy figure who might be connected to the murder at Hotel Hollis. I took the Leavenworth picture straight to the Rogues Gallery at police headquarters, methodically picking out half a dozen additional photographs, each one resembling Corey as closely as possible. Every angle, every shadow detail was considered, no stone left unturned. That same morning, I arranged to meet Miss May Jensen, the vaudeville actress who had encountered the mysterious figure on the night of the murder. I spread the carefully selected photographs out across the table, the images staring up like silent witnesses. I looked at her, noting the tension in her hands, the slight tremor of her lips. "Do any of these men look familiar?" I asked, my voice steady but urgent. "This is the man who confronted you in the corridor that night, who frightened you so badly that you had to run back to your room and lock the door." Her eyes scanned the photographs, lingering on faces, studying lines and shadows as though each might betray the truth. The room felt heavy, charged with anticipation. This was a pivotal moment. The first chance to match a witness's memory with the face of a man who had lurked in darkness, terrorizing a woman in her own hotel. Every second she took to decide could bring us one step closer to unraveling the mystery of Hotel Hollis, or leave the killer slipping further into the shadows. "That's the man. I'm sure of it," Miss May Jensen, the vaudeville actress, said with conviction, her finger pointing unwaveringly to the photograph of Frank Corey taken at Leavenworth. The air in the room seemed to thicken with tension as the first real lead in the baffling Hotel Hollis murder had finally materialized. A face, a name, a hint of the shadow who had haunted the corridors that tragic night. Meanwhile, Benny Peretti had left Boston to fulfill a theater engagement in New York, but I wasn't about to let that slow the investigation. I took the photographs with me and showed them to Benny, who immediately picked out the same image that Miss Jensen had identified. "That's the WAP," he confirmed, his voice steady, but tinged with unease. Even with these identifications, I had nothing concrete connecting this federal ex-convict to the murder itself. No known address, no trace of his current movements, nothing but a hunch and the faint hope that the pieces might somehow fit together. Superintendent Michael Crowley was fully backing me, urging me to push ahead, and he sent another urgent message to Leavenworth, requesting the names and addresses of anyone Frank Corey had corresponded with during his sentence. Prisons, of course, maintain meticulous records, and soon I received 3 names and addresses, one in Yonkers, New York, another in New York City, and a third in Worcester, Massachusetts. My first stop was Yonkers, where I discovered that the person Corey had written to was long dead. Undeterred, I turned to the New York City address, located on West 42nd Street, only to find a maternity hospital standing in place. The staff there knew nothing of the man I was hunting, leaving me again with only shadows and speculation as I pressed forward in my relentless search for the elusive figure known as the WAP. I enlisted the help of a New York police detective, and together we began a meticulous search, checking every building on the west side, from 32nd Street all the way up to 52nd. We spoke to the letter carriers, questioned residents, traced back every lead that Leavenworth had provided, but no one had ever heard of Frank Corey, nor the person listed as a correspondent of the ex-convict. The city felt like a labyrinth, the streets stretching endlessly, each corner offering nothing but shadows and dead ends. As a last resort, we turned our attention to the east side. The week had brought oppressive heat and a sticky, suffocating humidity to New York, and the grind of searching every street, every building, was beginning to take its toll. My body ached. My mind felt foggy from sleepless nights, and the detective finally threw up his hands, declaring he needed a rest. I promised myself just one more street, one last effort before I paused, desperate to find a clue that could break the case wide open. I stepped into a doorway to begin questioning a potential witness. Fate intervened in the most comical yet dangerous way. A kid was eating a banana, careless of the peel left behind. My foot landed on it, and I went down hard, slipping violently, my back nearly taking the full force of the fall. Pain shot through me, but even as I lay there, gasping and cursing, I couldn't let it break my focus. Somewhere in the tangled streets of New York, the trail of Frank Corey, the elusive wop, was waiting, and I knew I had to rise and keep hunting. This all happened on East 42nd Street, and the heat was suffocating, the kind that made every step feel like dragging through syrup. My back throbbed from the fall on the banana peel, yet all pain and fatigue vanished when I bumped into a woman who might just hold a key to the puzzle. She glanced at the photograph of Frank Corey, and her eyes widened. "I know him," she said. "He lived next door here years ago, with a Polish blonde. They cleaned out the landlady and disappeared with the loot." Her words sent a jolt of adrenaline through me. The story she told made sense. The Polish blonde was likely the woman Corey had written to from Leavenworth, and after his release, he had joined her in New York, plotting, scheming, hiding in plain sight. It was the first solid lead I'd had in weeks, the first flicker of light cutting through a maze of dead ends. But just as hope sparked, reality slammed back in. The house next door had been razed, leaving no trace of the couple or their activities. I tracked down the realtors who had handled the sale and eventually located the bank trustee who managed the transaction for the landlady. Even that trail ended abruptly. The landlady had passed away, taking with her any chance of further information. The trail in New York had gone cold. There were no witnesses, no letters, no addresses left to follow. With a deep sigh, I returned to Boston on June 21st, the city feeling both familiar and frustratingly distant. At the station house, I sat to write my reports, the weight of exhaustion and discouragement pressing down. Days of relentless searching had yielded a story, hints, and leads, but the killers still lurked in the shadows, just out of reach, taunting me from somewhere unknown. After returning to Boston, I had a meeting with Superintendent Michael Crowley, who listened as I laid out the last remaining lead, the address in Worcester. I explained that the New York trail had gone cold, but something about the Worcester address felt promising. Crowley gave me a firm nod. "Keep at it," he said. "I think your hunch has merit." With renewed determination, I set out the next morning, heading to Worcester, making arrangements at Worcester Police Headquarters to secure a detective to accompany me. The address I had was simple: Corey, 934 Grafton Street. As we made our way through the quiet Worcester streets, we encountered a motorcycle officer who happened to know the family living at that address. "The family there," he said, "goes by the name Krikorian, but they use the American name Corey." I showed him a photograph from Leavenworth, and his eyes widened. "Sure, I know that fellow," he said. "That's Frank Corey. I spoke with him this morning. There's sewage draining into the street from his property, and I told him it had to be fixed." That offhand remark sparked an idea. If we approached carefully, I could gain entry without alarming him. We decided the detective would accompany me, posing as an inspector from the health department. It was a delicate ruse, but it would allow me to speak directly with Corey, gain his trust, or at least not raise suspicion, and get him down to the Worcester police station for questioning. Every step had to be calculated. One wrong move, and the man responsible for the horrifying murder at Hotel Hollis could slip through our fingers once again. The tension was palpable, the air thick with anticipation. I could feel that at last, the investigation was on the verge of a breakthrough. Inside the Corey residence, I noticed a crippled young girl, quietly sitting in the corner, who informed me that her brother, Frank Corey, had gone into town and would soon return on the trolley car. While the detective accompanying me was discussing the sewage complaint in a casual tone, my eyes scanned the room and landed on a photograph lying on a table. The unmistakable face of Frank Corey, the ex-convict from Leavenworth who had haunted my thoughts for over 2 weeks. Without drawing attention, I slipped the photo into my pocket, a small but crucial step in the trap we were setting. Once that was done, we departed the house, moving deliberately but without arousing suspicion that we had arranged for the motorcycle officer to patrol the street up ahead, watching for the trolley and, more importantly, to spot Frank Corey if he was aboard. I concealed myself in the woods nearby, hidden from view, my heart racing with anticipation. Every nerve was on edge. I knew Corey would be cautious, perhaps suspicious, and I couldn't risk letting him slip away. Meanwhile, the Worcester detective went off to make a call, leaving me alone with the quiet tension of the trap. After what felt like an eternity, the motorcycle officer returned, confirming the news I had been waiting for. The man we were hunting was on the trolley and would soon be home. We began our measured walk toward the Corey residence, each step heightening the suspense, the late afternoon sunlight casting long shadows across the road. Then, just as we approached the yard, a massive, gorilla-like figure appeared, turning into the property with slow, deliberate steps. It was him, Frank Corey, the very man who had terrorized Hotel Hollis, eluded capture, and haunted my investigation for more than 2 weeks, now standing right before us, oblivious that the net had finally been drawn tight around him. We played our hand carefully, relying on the health department ruse, and it worked perfectly. Frank Corey, unaware that he was walking straight into the police trap, agreed to ride down to Worcester Police Headquarters under the pretense of getting the sewage complaint resolved. The tension in the car was thick. Every glance at him, every subtle movement was a test of nerves. At one point, he shook his head and muttered, almost with amusement, "Gee, you fellows really hound a guy." His casual tone did nothing to ease the knot of anticipation in my chest. We knew the danger of letting him sense our intentions. Once he was safely inside the station, the air shifted. No more ruse, no more pretense. I leaned forward and asked, "When were you in Boston last?" His answer was quick, flat, rehearsed. "I was never in Boston in my life." I pressed further, my voice calm but firm. "Do you know the Hotel Hollis?" Corey's denial came just as swiftly, his eyes flicking around the room. "Never heard of it. I was never in Boston in my life." I let the silence linger a moment, letting the weight of the moment sink in. Then I moved strategically, knowing that skilled criminals often play their cards close to the chest. "You know the ropes," I told him. "You don't have to talk if you don't want to. Do you know Benny Peretti?" His response was almost casual, a slip of truth hidden in plain sight. Over in Leavenworth Penitentiary, I placed his police photograph from Leavenworth in front of him, letting the evidence speak louder than words. "Is this your picture?" I asked. Corey's denial came instantly, confident. "That's not my picture." Then the final words were spoken, calm, deliberate, leaving no room for misinterpretation. "You are under arrest, charged with the murder of Mrs. May Price." Every word, every question had been meticulously documented. I handed him the statements he had made during our questioning and asked him to sign them, sealing the evidence that would lead to the unraveling of the Hotel Hollis mystery. For the first time in weeks, the long hunt was over, and the man we had been chasing with every ounce of patience and cunning was finally in our hands. Corey finally spoke, his voice low and wary. "I'll talk, but I won't sign anything." There was a cold calculation in his tone, as if he already knew how to play the system. He was locked in a cell, while I immediately telephoned a report to Boston Police Headquarters and was informed that Captain Goodwin, my superior and skipper at LeGrand Street Station, would be dispatched from Boston in a police car to take custody of the prisoner. While we waited, Worcester police dug deeper and uncovered more of Corey's criminal record. It turned out he had recently been arrested on charges of stealing a check and a bracelet. According to the records, he had made restitution to the victim shortly after Mrs. Price's murder, a detail that only seemed to add to the tangled web of his activities. During his confinement in Worcester, Corey somehow managed to communicate with the outside world, and soon a lawyer arrived to advise him. It was the same attorney who had represented him in the earlier restitution case, and under his counsel, Corey clammed up completely. From that point on, he would say nothing, remaining as silent and unyielding as an oyster. When the time came to transport him to Boston for arraignment, he was utterly composed, giving no hint of fear or guilt, yet every gesture seemed measured, calculated. The grand jury in Boston moved swiftly, indicting him for first-degree murder, and I set to work preparing what I believed to be a strong, airtight case for the upcoming trial. Every piece of evidence, every witness account, and every subtle clue from the painstaking investigation in Boston and Worcester was compiled, a meticulous foundation to bring the man responsible for the horrific Hotel Hollis murder to justice. I managed to recover the bracelet Corey had stolen in Worcester, tracing it to a man he had pledged it with as collateral for a small loan. A young Polish boy in Worcester told me that Corey had returned home in early June carrying a fat roll of bills. So much so that he sent the boy to the store just to buy a Boston newspaper. An odd display of wealth for a man laying low. A clerk at Hotel Hollis later confirmed Corey had stayed there on the night of May 28th, paying $1.50 in advance for room 512 under the name Frank Maliano. He had attempted to register again on May 30th, but the clerk refused a check written in pencil for $5, leaving him without a room. Miss Jensen, the vaudeville actress, positively identified Corey as the large, threatening man who had accosted her on the hotel's top floor the night of Mrs. Price's murder. A chilling encounter that had left her terrified and scrambling back to her room. All of the small threads, the bracelet, the Boston newspaper, the hotel registrations, and Miss Jensen's identification fit together into a damning picture. The district attorney was satisfied with the theory we had pieced together, and I felt the same. It seemed clear that Corey had been skulking on the 6th floor, where he accosted Miss Jensen, later taking the key from her door at room 606 to gain access to room 406. There, he had hidden beneath the bed, lying in wait for Mrs. Price to return and fall asleep, ready to strike. When we finally arrested him, he even had a package of cigarettes in his possession matching the partly smoked one found under Mrs. Price's bed, a small but telling piece of evidence tying him directly to the crime scene. Every detail reinforced the chilling sequence we had reconstructed, confirming the terrifying cunning with which Corey had carried out his crime, and my theory was that Corey, hiding under the bed, had begun to smoke while waiting for Mrs. Price, but the faint trail of smoke might have betrayed his presence. Realizing the risk, he extinguished the cigarette after only 1 or 2 puffs. From my investigation, it seemed clear that he remained concealed under the bed as Mrs. Price entered her room, carefully set her money on the bureau, undressed, and slipped into bed. When he judged from her breathing that she was asleep, he emerged from his hiding place and attempted to seize the money. A violent struggle ensued as Mrs. Price fought desperately for her life, scratching and clawing at him in terror. Evidence indicated that Corey grabbed her by the throat to silence her, sustaining severe scratches on his hands and face during the struggle. Further investigation revealed that a man matching Corey's description had visited a local drugstore the day after the murder, seeking treatment for deep scratches on his face. Worcester witnesses also reported that when Corey returned home early in June, his face and hands bore visible marks from the violent confrontation. Even at the time of his arrest, there remained a nearly healed cut on his face, which he claimed was a shaving accident. All these details fit together to support the theory that Corey had been hiding, waiting, and then violently confronted Mrs. Price in her final, terrifying moments. Corey's family spared no expense in mounting his defense, hiring a sharp and experienced criminal attorney, and the trial dragged on with intense scrutiny from all sides. After hours of deliberation, the jury finally returned a verdict of acquittal, leaving me stunned and bitterly disappointed, for both the district attorney and I were convinced of Corey's guilt. His past only deepened my concern. He had once deserted from the United States Army, a fact that later gave me a new avenue to pursue. Using this, I coordinated with federal authorities to have Corey temporarily detained as a deserter, buying time to investigate further. During the murder trial, There had been a gap in our knowledge about Corey's movements immediately following the crime. A chance eavesdropping at the courthouse had revealed a crucial lead. Two men spoke about Corey visiting a room on Hanover Street shortly after the murder. Following up on this tip, I traced him to the Crawford House Annex, where records confirmed he had checked in early on the morning of May 31st. Initially, he paid $2.50 for a room, but upon inspecting it, he deemed it unsuitable and upgraded to another room, paying $3.50. This detail, though seemingly minor, helped fill in the critical hours immediately following the crime and reinforced the careful, methodical movements of a man trying to evade detection that I soon discovered that Corey had left a raincoat at the Hanover Street room, the same coat he had been wearing when he entered, and I carefully recovered it. This coat would later be positively identified by Miss Jensen and several other witnesses as the one he had on at Hotel Hollis, further linking him to the scene of the crime. For a time, the trail appeared to go cold at Hanover Street, but I refused to let the investigation stall. My persistence paid off when I was able to place him the following night at the Boston Tavern on May 31st, 1925. The hotel register confirmed my suspicions. Corey had arrived with a female companion and paid $6 for the room, corroborating the timeline and movements I had meticulously tracked. With this critical evidence in hand, we were ready to move forward with the next phase we had been planning quietly. The case was presented to the grand jury, and a secret indictment was returned against Frank Krikorian, known by multiple aliases including Corey, Costello, and Muliono, formally charging him with the robbery and related crimes at Hotel Hollis. Acting on this warrant, I traveled to Camp Devens, Massachusetts, where federal authorities cooperated fully, delivering the prisoner into my custody to face justice. The trial that followed captured the attention of the city and was nothing short of sensational. Frank Corey, who had previously been acquitted of Mrs. Price's murder, now faced charges for the robbery connected to that same crime. Once again, he was represented by a shrewd and experienced criminal attorney, but this time the jury returned a verdict that left no room for doubt. Corey was found guilty of the robbery. The defense immediately raised the argument that Corey was being subjected to double jeopardy, appealing to the higher courts in an effort to overturn the conviction. However, these appeals were denied, and the verdict stood. When it came time to pass sentence, Judge Lowry did not mince words. He imposed a life imprisonment sentence on Corey, emphasizing the extreme atrocity of the crime and praising the jury for their careful deliberation. The judge also noted that the unusually harsh sentence was justified not only by the severity of the robbery, but also by the unexpected circumstances surrounding the previous murder trial, underscoring the court's determination to deliver justice. Case 8 Bill Bohannon's fascination with women had begun early in life and seemed almost innate, a restless curiosity and ardent desire that followed him through his college days and into adulthood. Even as a student at Indiana University in Bloomington, where he was preparing for a promising career in law, he had developed a reputation for being charming, persuasive, and irresistible to women, a skill that earned him both admiration and whispered envy. There, nestled in a secluded spot near the campus, came to be known Bohannon's Hollow, a hidden trysting place where he would woo ardently on balmy spring nights, the vigor and flush of youth lending fire to his pursuits. After graduation, Bohannon married, yet the ties of matrimony could not contain his restless nature or his insatiable interest in the company of women, and his life remained colored by clandestine romances and whispered scandals. The city was thrown into a state of uneasy curiosity and suspense when, on a cool September evening, he returned home wounded with 2 mysterious bullets lodged in his body, and rumors immediately began to ripple through the streets, carried on the hum of hushed voices asking, "Who is she?" As chief of police in Evansville, the responsibility to uncover the truth, to piece together the tangled threads of Bohannon's secretive life and determine the identity of those involved in the shocking attack, fell squarely upon me, and the task promised to be as delicate and intricate as the man's own shadowed affairs. It was the night of September 14th, 1928, a night that began with an uneasy calm at police headquarters. The usual hum of activity had slowed to a near halt, officers passing the time with games of cribbage or checkers, the kind of quiet that can lull the untrained into thinking nothing will happen. But police know better. The stillest hours often precede the storm. Moments of peace that can erupt without warning in a gunfire, chaos, or the bitterly sharp sting of death. And on that night, the calm was shattered in an instant. At exactly 9 o'clock, a telephone call sliced through the quiet, sending a shockwave across the city. Bohannon's shot. From that moment, the rhythm of life at headquarters shifted into feverish intensity. For 48 hours, the station buzzed with unrelenting activity. Officers rushing, messages flying, and every report and rumor scrutinized for the slightest clue. Its echoes still resonating in local memory, even decades later. Among the first to carry the news to the public was Albert Felker, police reporter for the Evansville Courier, whose dispatch to his city editor ignited the presses, thrusting this startling revelation into the ears and eyes of a city already bracing for a story that would grip it from that instant onward and tea that time. That was all Albert Felker had, and all the Evansville Courier could report when its final edition hit the streets 5 hours later. The newspaper detailed Bohannon's injuries, his rambling statements before losing consciousness, and his critical physical condition, but it could not disclose where the shooting had taken place, nor the motive behind it. What the public did not yet know was that 3 other lives had been violently entangled in the same night's tragic chain of events. William O. Bohannon, the focal point of this grim drama of passion and sudden death, was a prominent lawyer in Evansville. Educated, well-groomed, courteous, and polished, he projected the air of a man comfortable in the world of sophistication. His practice was thriving, specializing largely in divorce cases, a domain where his charm and skill found constant application. Bohannon had always had a particular talent for connecting with women, and women, in turn, were drawn to him. Broad-shouldered, handsome, and virile, he combined those traits with a gentle, understanding manner. Years of listening to clients pour out their marital troubles had honed his gift for empathetic conversation, and he carried an air of near swagger, born of confidence and the subtle magnetism of a man used to being admired. That Bohannon's charm was always tempered by a sense of gallantry. Had he not clung so closely to notions of chivalry, it is likely that his tangled web of affairs might have continued unnoticed for much longer. But gallantry for Bohannon was never optional. It was a guiding principle, one that both aided and complicated his life. The date was Friday, September 14th, 1928, a night reserved for Bohannon's club meetings. To his wife, these gatherings were shrouded in mystery, said to be political in nature and sacredly private. The inner workings of the group were known only to a chosen few, and even the names of its members were withheld from Mrs. Bohannon. At roughly 9:15, she sat in the living room of their comfortable home at 1201 Blackford Avenue, engaged in a quiet conversation with a friend, utterly unaware that a night of tragedy was already unfolding just beyond her threshold. Suddenly, she thought she heard her name called, faintly at first, as if carried by the wind. "Lillian." The voice came again, insistent and unmistakable. Heart quickening, she rose and opened the door. There, at the curb, was her husband's car, engine idling and lights glowing in the dim evening. And within the vehicle, she thought she saw him slumped behind the wheel, a sight that would etch itself in her memory and mark the beginning of a night none would soon forget. Then the whisper came again, just a hoarse murmur this time, but calm, deliberate, and controlled, as if even in his agony, William Bohannon sought to protect his wife from panic. Startled, she ran to the car, her heart pounding, only to hear him gasp, "Honey, I've been shot, 2 hold-up men," before his voice trailed off into incoherent murmurs. Later, in a fleeting moment of lucidity at the hospital, he whispered, "Honey, forgive me. You have been so kind," and then fell silent. Friends rushed to her side, and Bohannon was hurried to Deaconess Hospital, where detectives waited outside the operating room for any sign of news, while reporters lingered tensely in the lobby, grasping at fragments of information. All that could be confirmed at first was harrowing. Bohannon had been struck by 2 bullets, one through the abdomen, exiting at the back, and the other through the chest. both potentially fatal. Early consultations were held with prosecuting attorney Eminzi's Lindsay and chief of detectives Edward Suttheimer, as they groped blindly for a lead in what appeared a baffling case. Mrs. Bohannon could offer no insight, leaving only one certainty. This would become a sensational and tragic story that gripped the entire city. The shooting of a prominent and widely respected attorney naturally stirred intense interest and speculation, a sensation heightened by the fact that William Bohannon was a man known not only for his sharp legal mind but also for his charm and attractiveness, especially to women, who had long admired his confidence and poise. Throughout the remainder of that fateful night, every aspect of the shooting remained a mystery, wrapped in conjecture and anxious guesses. Questions hung in the air. Where had the attack occurred, and how far from his home could he have driven while so grievously wounded? His brief, fragmented account to his wife seemed insufficient, perhaps deliberately incomplete, leaving detectives convinced that he had withheld some vital detail, if not the truth itself. Clearly, someone had deliberately targeted him. But who could have harbored such malice, and why? As dawn approached, Bohannon remained unconscious in the hospital, his powerful frame struggling against the life-threatening injuries that had rendered him helpless, while I mobilized the entire police force to unravel the tangled threads of this crime. The examination of his automobile offered little insight. There were no physical clues, no evidence of a struggle inside the vehicle. Yet upon closer inspection, a startling discovery emerged. While 2 bullets had pierced his shirt, his coat and vest, which he'd been wearing when he returned home, bore no sign of damage. The natural inference was chillingly clear. He had been attacked while partially undressed, perhaps in a vulnerable moment with a woman present, an unsettling possibility that hinted at a carefully orchestrated assault rather than a random act of violence. And it cast the investigation into a shadowy realm of intrigue, danger, and unanswered questions that demanded immediate and meticulous attention. Speculation swirled around every corner of the investigation, each theory more tantalizing than the last, as questions about William Bohannon's life and relationships began to mingle with the brutal facts of the shooting. Had he crossed boundaries with another man's wife, charming or persuading someone he should not have, only to have that confidence betrayed? Could a captivated listener have conveyed his attentions to a jealous spouse or a spurned lover, setting the stage for retribution? Or was it a cold, calculated act, a hired gun lying in wait to take him for a ride? Coroner Max Lowe, known for his meticulous attention to detail, was the first to propose a theory that seemed to fit the limited evidence. He suggested that Bohannon had been out with a woman whose identity he sought to protect, and that along some secluded stretch just outside the city, the couple had been ambushed by assailants intent on robbery or intimidation. In the struggle, Bohannon had resisted, not only to save himself but to shield the woman, and that resistance had led to his being shot. The location of the attack was critical. It could not have occurred within the city, for no one had reported gunfire to the police, and the timing of the shooting indicated he had managed to drive home despite his grievous injuries, leaving the exact distance and route as one of the unanswered riddles of the case. Yet through all the uncertainty, one element seemed certain to the investigators. At the heart of this violent episode lay a woman, the key to both the motive and the identity of the perpetrators, and until her role, direct or indirect, was uncovered, the true story behind Bohannon's near-fatal shooting remained shrouded in shadows, mystery, and the tense anticipation of revelation. The order came down like a hammer. Find that woman. It was a command heavy with urgency and implication, for whispers of Bohannon's flirtations and indiscretions had long circulated in subdued tones, and now those rumors demanded confirmation. Someone, surely, must know the woman, or women, who had played a part in the events that led to the shooting, yet no one stepped forward that night to speak openly, either out of fear or discretion. In the hours that followed, detectives questioned a number of women who might have been connected to the drama, probing their movements and interactions, only to have one depart on a train for Chicago immediately after being interviewed, and the rest provide accounts that appeared satisfactory, leaving no concrete leads. Meanwhile, Bohannon himself, weakened and drifting in and out of consciousness, offered no further revelations beyond his fragmented claim that two holed-up men were responsible, and physicians warned that his condition was critical, with the hours slipping away like grains of sand through an hourglass. Then, as the first light of morning illuminated the streets, a breakthrough emerged almost by accident. While examining Bohannon's automobile more closely than the previous night, detectives discovered a seemingly innocuous clue clinging to the undercarriage of the car: corn stalks bent and torn, which would ultimately provide a vital thread in unraveling the tangled story of the shooting and hint at the precise location where the attack had occurred. The corn stalks clinging to Bohannon's automobile hinted that he had passed through or near some stretch of highway bordered by fields of corn, but at first, this detail seemed trivial. After all, nearly every road out of the city cut through the tall, dense corn that swayed across southern Indiana in mid-September. The clue offered little guidance, and the investigation seemed to grind to a frustrating halt. Detectives sat in uneasy silence, each quietly constructing theories of the crime and then tearing them apart, knowing that without someone coming forward, whether the mysterious woman whose presence had played a part in the shooting or the criminals themselves, the case might remain forever unsolved. Then, at precisely 10 o'clock that morning, the first tangible break in the case arrived almost as if by fate. The lifeless body of a man was discovered at the far edge of a cornfield, roughly 4 miles from the city limits. Word reached us immediately, and I, along with Coroner Max Lowe and Sheriff Shelby McDowell, hurried to the scene. The man had been shot twice, once through the right shoulder and once directly through the heart, and the execution of the attack suggested ruthlessness and precision. He had been found by a local farmer, Henry Schwartz, who, driving his wagon along the field's edge, noticed the figure partially concealed in a shallow ditch. Had he been passing in a faster vehicle, it might have gone completely unnoticed. The discovery electrified the investigation, transforming speculation into tangible evidence and sending a ripple of urgency through every officer involved. For this dead man might hold the key to unraveling the dark puzzle of Bohannon's shooting. The road where the grisly discovery had been made, known as Lynch Road, lay 4 miles from the city and carried an air of secrecy that made it a favored meeting place for lovers whose hearts harbored untold confessions. It was a remote stretch, seldom patrolled by deputy sheriffs, and its quiet isolation lent itself to clandestine encounters and hidden dangers. Instantly, investigators drew a connection between the dead man discovered there and the fatal shooting of Bohannon, sensing that this discovery might illuminate the mysterious chain of events that had stunned the city. Bohannon himself had always been an expert with firearms, a passion that extended far beyond mere hobby. On a nearby tract of land where he maintained a summer home, he had constructed a private rifle range, spending countless hours in solitude, coaxing precise shots from revolvers and automatics, honing his skills with a keen eye and a teasing finger on the trigger. Perhaps unknowingly, he had been preparing for a moment when deadly accuracy and rapid response would be essential. Ever prudent, he never drove without a firearm within reach. His car had been specially modified with a holster built into the driver's seat, allowing him to draw a weapon quickly with the minimum of motion, ready for the kind of sudden, dangerous confrontation that would now test the full measure of his skill and courage if the young man found in the ditch had crossed paths with Bohannon in a violent confrontation. It seemed nearly certain that he had come face to face with the skill honed through countless hours of the attorney's relentless target practice. The body belonged to a man likely in his early to mid-20s, heavily built, with broad shoulders and a neck as thick and muscular as a bull's, suggesting the strength of a wrestler or pugilist. His face bore the hallmarks of a hard life and a robust constitution: a square, determined jaw, a wide, stubby nose, and a dark, weathered complexion that hinted at foreign lineage, possibly Southern European, a rarity in Evansville at the time. Clutched tightly in his right hand was a rope, while a flashlight and a billfold lay scattered nearby, silent witnesses to the desperate events that had unfolded. Evidence of a struggle was unmistakable. Not far from the body, the cornfield had been brutally torn asunder, the stalks crushed and flattened to form a narrow, nearly straight path, wide enough to accommodate a vehicle moving at a dangerous speed, as if someone had fled the scene in a panic, leaving behind the chilling trace of sudden, violent action. An firearm was recovered from the scene, and Bohannon's own weapon, which he was known to carry the night before, remained unaccounted for, deepening the mystery of what had transpired. The identity of the young man found in the ditch was equally elusive. All papers, letters, or personal effects that might have revealed who he was were missing, leaving the authorities without a single clue. The body was transported to the undertaking parlors of Klee and Burkhart in Evansville, where officers meticulously examined his clothing for any mark of identification. His cap, a distinguishing feature, had been purchased in Detroit. While the suit he wore had come from Chicago, the painstaking inspection eventually revealed a faint, nearly illegible laundry mark on his garments, the initials F. Though this clue seemed minor, Albert Felker, the enterprising reporter for the Evansville Courier, immediately took it upon himself to investigate, tracing the mark through the city's laundries. Among the dozen or more establishments, only 3 used the initials of a customer's first and last names to mark clothing. The first laundry had no matching patron. The second offered a glimmer of hope, as the bookkeeper recalled someone whose laundry corresponded to the initials F and even knew the person's address. The third, however, was the most intriguing. The initials matched a customer described as middle-aged, dark, and of slightly foreign appearance. But frustration mounted when Felker learned that the laundry had no other identifying information. The man's name and precise address remained unknown. Disheartened, Felker stepped away from the telephone, knowing that the young man on the morgue slab still held his secrets tightly. The puzzle of his identity, stubbornly unresolved, it became increasingly clear that the dead man and the wounded William Bohannon had crossed paths on that fateful Friday night. The evidence left no room for doubt. The tire tracks carved through the cornfield matched perfectly with those of Bohannon's automobile, and fragments of cornstalks clung stubbornly to the undercarriage, confirming the route he had taken. Mrs. Bohannon added a crucial piece to the puzzle when she identified the billfold found clutched in the hands of the deceased as her husband's property, establishing a direct link between the two men. She also produced Bohannon's firearm, which she had discovered in his car and carefully concealed, a revolver whose caliber corresponded exactly with the bullets that had ended the stranger's life. 3 rounds had been discharged recently, the gun's mechanism having jammed before a 4th could be fired. A search of both men's belongings revealed nothing. Bohannon's billfold was empty, and the dead man's pockets had been turned inside out, completely devoid of money. No coins or bills were scattered across the field, a glaring absence that suggested the presence of a 4th party, a companion to the slain man who had vanished without leaving a trace. Bohannon himself had mentioned 2 hold-up men, a statement that now took on a new, ominous significance. In one swift sweep, what had started as a single mysterious shooting had multiplied into 3 intertwined enigmas. The identity of the dead man, the whereabouts of his elusive companion, and the role of the woman who might have been present. Answers to at least 2 of these questions seemed essential before the final revelation could emerge. Meanwhile, the city's morbid curiosity was on full display. An endless procession of people filed through the morgue, eyes lingering on the lifeless face, shaking their heads, whispering theories, and hurrying on to join small clusters outside, all speculating in hushed tones about the stranger who had arrived from nowhere and whose secrets had so far eluded every investigator. The dead man's powerful, wrestler-like build sparked immediate speculation among the authorities, and someone recalled that a carnival had been in Evansville the previous week, featuring a performer named Frank Martin whose physique seemed to match the lifeless form on the morgue slab. Lauren Keeley, both an attorney and a wrestling promoter, was summoned for his opinion. He resembles him somewhat, Keeley admitted, but I couldn't be certain. A long-distance call was promptly made to the carnival, which was then performing in Hickman, Kentucky, in hopes of confirming the identity. The response was disheartening. The wrestler was accounted for with the carnival, and as far as anyone knew, entirely unharmed, carrying no evidence of gunshot wounds. Meanwhile, Bohannon's condition at the hospital remained critical, his life slipping away with each passing hour, and he offered no further revelations about the attack, leaving the mystery of the stranger seemingly unsolvable. Just as dusk threatened to settle over the case without a clue, a breakthrough occurred. Arthur B. Burkhart, the undertaker overseeing the dead man's body, overheard a young woman, perhaps 18, approach the corpse and gasp, "Poor Frank." Seizing the moment, Burkhart asked if she knew the man. "Yes," she responded, struggling to catch her breath. "He roomed with the Meadors on Harriet Street. Frank was a good boy. I knew him." In the excitement, Burkhart neglected to obtain her name. But at nearly the same time, Patrolman Collison received an independent tip from a friend who had visited the morgue, revealing that while the stranger was not personally known to him, he had lived with a friend at 1314 Harriet Street, further narrowing the search for the mysterious man whose fate was now intertwined with Bohannon's near-fatal encounter. Collison immediately transmitted his information to police headquarters, finally, giving the investigation a concrete lead to pursue, something tangible to guide the officers through the fog of uncertainty that had hung over the case. Ironically, the man who was about to be arrested had earlier visited the morgue that very afternoon, spending a significant stretch of time standing silently before the body, staring at the corpse with a face that revealed nothing of the tumult of thoughts and emotions surely raging within him. Just as the dead man's face, frozen in death, betrayed no hint of the agony and struggle he had endured in his final moments, so too did the expression of this friend remain an unreadable mask, revealing nothing to the casual observer. Officers quickly discovered that the Meadors, with whom the man had lived, had moved that very day from 1314 Harriet Street to a new residence at 1102 Harriet Street, just 2 blocks away, and it was there that Frank Paisley, aged 24 and originally from Essex, Missouri, was taken into custody. Paisley, as it turned out, had no prior criminal record, and his account of his connection with the deceased, far from being incriminating, appeared wholly plausible. He identified the dead man as Frank Mills, a 19-year-old from Chicago, separated from his wife and of Lithuanian descent, whose real surname was Milchinas. Paisley explained that he and Mills had previously worked together in Detroit before arriving in Evansville roughly 6 weeks prior, where they found employment at a local furniture factory. Economic conditions, however, had rendered work scarce, and both had been laid off for the previous 2 weeks. On the evening preceding the tragedy, Paisley recounted he and Mills set out together in Paisley's automobile, but when they reached Garvin Park, Mills encountered a female acquaintance and left Paisley's company. After driving around briefly on his own, Paisley returned to his boarding place, setting the stage for the fateful events that would culminate in Bohannon's near-fatal shooting and the mysterious death of his companion. There was, at first glance, nothing in Frank Paisley's story to cast doubt upon his honesty or his involvement in the crime. Every detail he offered seemed coherent, consistent, and unassailable. He spoke calmly, with a measured tone, and his account matched what the officers could verify of his movements. Those who knew him best, the elder Metter and his son Lee, assured the police that Paisley had returned home early the previous evening, joining the family for a quiet game of cards, his demeanor calm, friendly, and entirely normal. There had been no signs of agitation, no flashes of anger or worry, no furtive behavior that might hint at a guilty conscience or a violent temper. He conducted himself precisely as he always had, polite and respectful, sober-minded and industrious. Likewise, Mills, who shared the boarding house room with him, was described as orderly, cooperative, and well-behaved, contributing nothing to the officer's suspicions. In every aspect, Paisley appeared to be a young man of good character, someone whose actions and words could not readily be questioned, making it extremely difficult for law enforcement to conceive that he could have played any part in the shocking incident, even if they allowed, with some hesitation, that his companion Mills might have been involved. To the police, the puzzle remained intricate and unsolved, with Paisley's outward respectability providing a frustrating barrier to unraveling the night's violent mystery. Despite Paisley's calm demeanor and seemingly impeccable story, the detectives were not satisfied. He was brought to police headquarters for further questioning, where more thorough and meticulous inquiry could be conducted. Meanwhile, detectives Charles Freer, Paul Newhouse, and Opal Russell were dispatched to Paisley's room to conduct a search. The officers moved with quiet efficiency, combing every corner of the modest boarding space until they uncovered a revolver carefully concealed. The weapon was brought directly to headquarters, where it underwent immediate examination. It was confirmed to be of the same caliber as that used in the shooting of Bohannon, and it bore the unmistakable marks of recent use. When confronted with the evidence, Paisley initially clung to his story, insisting that he had no knowledge of the crime and denying any involvement whatsoever. But the detective's questioning was relentless, intense, and unyielding, probing every inconsistency and pressing him with carefully structured inquiries. Within the hour, the pressure bore fruit. Paisley broke down and confessed. His voice, tinged with a mix of resignation and apprehension, recounted the events of that fateful evening. About 6:30 o'clock on the evening of September 14th, he admitted, "Frank Mills and I left our home on Harriet Street in my automobile. We drove out along State Road number 41, continuing north for about a mile before turning east and proceeding another mile. Mills then directed me to stop the car at the side of the road near a wooded area, where what happened next would forever alter our lives and thrust us into the center of a murder investigation." Paisley's confession unfolded with grim precision, revealing the calculated and sinister plan of that evening. He recounted that Mills had told him he intended to catch a couple parked along the road, with the goal of forcibly removing the man from the car and abducting the woman. Mills carried a gun, which he showed to Paisley, emphasizing the seriousness of the scheme. Following Mills's directions, Paisley stopped the car at the predetermined spot, and Mills produced a window cord rope approximately 10 feet in length. The two men exited the car and crouched down in the ditch along the south side of the road. Mills cut the cord in half, giving Paisley one portion while retaining the other, and instructed him to bring along the flashlight he habitually kept in the car. They lay in the ditch, motionless, for nearly 2 hours, waiting for their target. Finally, a vehicle approached from the west and stopped at the roadside, roughly 200 feet from Paisley's car. Upon seeing it, Mills whispered, "That's it now," though Paisley could not tell whether Mills recognized the occupants. Mills then laid out his instructions. He would hold the gun on the man, and Paisley was to use the flashlight to illuminate him while restraining him with the rope. Stealthily, the two men crawled on their hands and knees down the ditch, inching closer to the parked car. Paisley approached the right side of the vehicle while Mills moved to the right rear. With the flashlight in hand, Paisley shone its beam into the car, and their eyes fell upon a man and a woman seated in the back, completely unaware of the danger that had silently approached them in the darkness. Paisley described the tense confrontation with meticulous detail, as if replaying each second of that harrowing night. The couple in the car had been in an intimate embrace when he first called out, asking what they were doing, but the man ignored him. Mills, meanwhile, positioned himself at the back of the vehicle, gun in hand, ready to take control. Paisley instructed the man to exit the car, and he complied, stepping onto the roadside near the ditch where Paisley was crouched. Paisley commanded him to place his hands behind his back so he could be tied, but instead, the man argued and resisted. At that moment, Mills moved to take control, ordering the man to face away while he prepared to bind his hands. The struggle escalated as the man stumbled partially into the car's front door, and in the confusion, managed to draw his own revolver. Chaos erupted. The two men tumbled into the ditch, Mills landing upright almost over the man, and the shots rang out. Mills fired at the man while standing, and the man returned fire, sending 2 bullets toward Mills and 1 at Paisley. Instinctively, Paisley leapt into the ditch and fled east, the bullets whizzing perilously close as he hit the ground. Amid the chaos, he glimpsed one of the assailants rise from the ditch, slip into the car, and speed away eastward along the road, leaving the scene in a blur of terror, gunfire, and darkness. As soon as the car sped away into the darkness, Paisley returned to where Mills lay motionless in the ditch, his body twisted on its left side. He called out to him, but there was no response, no sound of breathing, and for a moment he feared Mills had been killed outright. Gathering Mills' revolver, Paisley began walking back toward his own car along the ditch, his heart pounding with the remnants of fear and adrenaline. The pocketbook and flashlight the man with the girl had handed to Mills during their heated argument, an attempt to buy off Mills and protect the woman, had been entrusted to Paisley, and he disposed of them beneath a culvert to eliminate any trace. Mills had confided in him that he wasn't after money, but the girl, boasting that his tricks were usually safe because most couples caught along country roads at night feared scandal more than confrontation. Paisley drove home afterward, carefully placing the revolver in a dresser drawer without unloading the shells, a silent witness to the night's deadly chaos. His confession, meticulously recounted, was signed in the presence of Coroner Lowe, Chief Detective Iris C. Wiltshire, Detective Philip C. Gould, Bohannon's attorney and friend, and the reporting officer, just after 7 o'clock on that fateful Saturday night. Less than 2 hours later, at 8:55 p.m., news arrived from the hospital that William Bohannon had succumbed to his mortal wounds. With Mills dead, Bohannon dead, and the woman's identity still a mystery, the authorities were left only with Paisley's account of the horror that had unfolded along Lynch Road, and it seemed, at that moment, certain that the woman's identity might never be revealed. Within the next 24 hours, the city would be shaken by another revelation as the sequence of events following the shooting became clearer. Badly wounded yet driven by a sense of honor and protective instinct, Bohannon had managed to shield his female companion from the violent intentions of Paisley and Mills. Despite the pain and the mortal threat to his own life, he drove his automobile at a furious speed, heading toward Oak Hill Road. When he spotted Paisley's car parked on the highway, he swerved sharply to the left, cutting through the dense cornfield owned by Schwartz. The corn, tall and thick in mid-September, whipped against the fenders, leaving a trail through the field for nearly a quarter of a mile. Schwartz, who had heard the gunshots, approached the scene, mistaking Bohannon for a corn thief, and even fired twice with a shotgun as the car roared past. Undeterred, Bohannon pressed forward, skillfully navigating the hay field where he stopped momentarily to remove the stalks clinging to his car. With a mixture of desperation and sheer driving skill, he burst out onto the private road leading to the Schwartz home, rejoined Lynch Road safely ahead of the bandit's vehicle, turned onto Oak Hill Road, and finally reached the safety of his home, his courage and quick thinking having prevented what could have been a devastating tragedy for both himself and the young woman. The city of Evansville was electric with tension on that Sunday, its streets and homes buzzing with whispered conjectures about the mysterious woman involved in the tragedy. Names were spoken cautiously, theories advanced in private parlors, on street corners, and in every circle of gossip. Had Bohannon's assailants been hired to kill him? Did Mills know the identities of the car's occupants when he declared, "That's it now"? Was he a paid executioner, commissioned by some jealous husband or an outraged lover? To explore the possibility that Mills had been connected to Bohannon in some previous encounter, the authorities brought in Miss Norma Fugger, Bohannon's stenographer, to view the corpse of Mills at the morgue. She insisted she had never seen him in the lawyer's office, which seemed to support Paisley's story that the events of that night were opportunistic rather than premeditated. Mills and Paisley had gone out seeking a victim, and Bohannon had been struck purely by chance. Yet, even decades later, the Bohannon case retained its notoriety in Evansville, with many still convinced that Bohannon had paid the ultimate price not merely for that night's misfortune, but for his past entanglements with women. Late Sunday afternoon, Albert Felker, the dog reporter who had closely followed every twist of the case, pressed Captain of Police August Hennison for permission to interrogate Paisley again. "He hasn't told all," Felker argued. "We could get a new confession out of him." So insistent was Felker's reasoning, backed by his meticulous study of the evidence, that Hennison finally agreed, and together they approached the prisoner's cell, convinced that Paisley's original confession might not reveal the full truth of the horrifying events along Lynch Road. Felker, ever the smooth and patient operator, approached Paisley with an air of quiet admiration. his tone carefully chosen to inspire confidence. He explained that he wished to hear Paisley's account for his paper, appealing to the prisoner's need to tell his story in his own words. For the first time since his arrest, Paisley experienced sympathetic attention, and he relaxed into the confidential tenor of the conversation. Felker's questions were pointed yet measured, each designed to draw out the hidden truth. But how, Felker asked, did it happen that Mills did the shooting when he had the rope in his hands? How could he manage a gun with both hands occupied? Paisley hesitated, then admitted, well, he did it. Captain Hennison interjected softly at intervals, urging the prisoner to be honest, and under this combination of pressure and empathy, Paisley began to weaken. Finally, head bowed, he whispered the words that had eluded the authorities before. I killed Bohannon. Though quietly spoken, both Felker and Hennison recognized that the confession was genuine. Paisley explained that he had been unable to sleep, burdened by the weight of his guilt, and that revealing the truth offered him a measure of relief, even if it meant facing the gallows. Slowly, he recounted the events, mostly consistent with his previous statements, but with crucial new details emerging. His story now complete, told freely and without concealment, unburdening a soul that had been silently tormented through the long hours of his confinement. Paisley now claimed that his original intention that night had been robbery alone, and that it was Mills who relentlessly pushed the darker plan of getting the girl. He said he argued against it, insisting that he wanted no part in such an act, but Mills would not be dissuaded. When Mills ordered him to tie Bohannon's hands behind his back, Paisley flatly refused, and it was then, according to him, that Mills snapped in anger and said, "Hell, I'll do it myself." Mills handed the revolver to Paisley and immediately grappled with Bohannon, the two men struggling violently until they lost their footing and tumbled into the ditch. As they scrambled to their feet, Bohannon staggered and struck against the door of the automobile. And in that instant, Paisley said he believed Bohannon was reaching for a gun. Almost at once, Bohannon fired. Mills reeled backward and collapsed as Bohannon fired again. Paisley said that at this point he fired twice at Bohannon, more in panic than calculation, and then ducked just as Bohannon's gun cracked for the third time. Throughout the argument and gunfire, Paisley said the girl inside the car was screaming uncontrollably, her cries cutting through the darkness and confusion of the night. Paisley maintained that he did not believe he had struck Bohannon at all, since Bohannon was still able to get back into his automobile and drive away without visible difficulty. He emphasized that although he had served in both the Navy and the Army and was considered an expert pistol shot, the darkness, the confusion, and the uncertainty of his target made accuracy impossible. He insisted that he fired only in self-defense, not with intent to kill. Paisley further stated that Mills had told him of numerous similar crimes he had committed while living in Springfield, Illinois, explaining how he and an accomplice would lie in wait at secluded trysting places, stop parked cars, bind the man, and then assault the woman. Mills had boasted that such attacks usually met little resistance, as victims feared exposure more than violence, a belief that ultimately led to the fatal confrontation on Lynch Road that night. This second confession, painstakingly wrung from Paisley, provided a sensational break for the newspaper, yet another, far more tragic development was unfolding behind the scenes. At 8 o'clock that same night, Norma Fugger, Bohannon's young stenographer, ended her life by swallowing carbolic acid. Paisley had insisted he did not know the identity of the woman he had glimpsed only fleetingly in the rear seat of the automobile that night. She was young and she was a blonde, he had said, and that was the limit of his knowledge. Norma, 20 years old, fair-haired, and undeniably pretty, was quiet and gentle, her reputation unblemished. At the time of her death, her name had not been publicly mentioned, though the prosecuting attorney, Lindsay, had been visiting the Bohannon residence to question Mrs. Bohannon when the tragedy occurred. Born and raised in the tranquil Indiana town of Gentryville, a place steeped in the lore of Abraham Lincoln's youth, Norma had grown up in a peaceful environment, her life seemingly as calm and orderly as the village itself, where Lincoln had earned the enduring nickname Honest Abe while working as a clerk in Jones' store. She had come to Evansville 2 years earlier to attend business college, where she proved herself a diligent and conscientious student. Though not brilliant in the academic sense, she displayed an exceptional sense of responsibility and meticulousness, applying herself thoroughly to her work and to nothing else. Her friends recalled, leading a life of simplicity and focus, unmarked by scandal or indiscretion. Yet in the fateful days of the Bohannon case, her name would be thrust into the center of a scandalous drama, and the tragedy of her death underscored the grim reality of the night's events, casting a pall over the investigation and foreshadowing the human cost behind the headlines of those who knew her. Norma Fugger was a gentle, unassuming girl, one whose temperament and demeanor seemed almost untouched by the restless stirrings of youth. She carried herself with a quiet seriousness that set her apart from the more thrill-seeking members of her generation. She neither drank nor smoked, and her attendance at dances or social gatherings was infrequent and measured, a reflection of her deliberate, reserved nature. Her friends would later describe her as a girl without a date, a solitary figure who had lived her life quietly and without scandal. Yet, in an astonishing and tragic turn, she had suddenly thrust herself into the center of the Bohannon case, leaving it as dramatically as life could allow, by taking her own life. The questions that arose were immediate and haunting. Why had she, whose name had not even been mentioned publicly, whose conduct had given no hint of involvement or suspicion, made such a startling appearance only to vanish forever by her own hand? Those who knew her and understood the case accepted her act as self-condemnatory, though no one voiced this openly, the weight of it hanging silently over the investigation. To understand the tragedy fully, one had to piece together her movements during the critical hours between Bohannon's departure from his home and the moment she ingested poison in the modest kitchen of the house she shared with her widowed mother. Bohannon had left his home that fateful Friday evening at around 7 o'clock. Norma, at that same time, was seen boarding a bus on Weinbach Avenue, a vehicle bound for 8th and Main Streets. By 7:30, Bohannon was recognized by a friend seated alone in his parked automobile near 8th and Main Streets, already mortally wounded and unaware of what the night would hold. He returned to his home at 8:45, struggling to survive, while Norma, according to her mother, arrived home between 8:30 and 9 o'clock. Her demeanor was calm, unremarkable, and betrayed no outward indication of the emotional or psychological turmoil she had endured during those hours. Her mother did not question her about where she had been, and Norma offered no explanation, as was consistent with her reserved character. She spoke little in general, and her silence in that moment, though ominous in retrospect, had seemed ordinary and unexceptional at the time. The following day, Saturday, Miss Clarice Cummings, who had been Norma Fugger's closest friend and confidant, reached her by telephone, eager to learn how she was coping with the shocking news. Norma's reaction was one of genuine surprise. She could scarcely comprehend that her employer, William Bohannon, had been shot. Yet alongside that surprise, a shadow of depression and worry settled over her, a natural response considering she had been in Bohannon's employ for more than a year. During that time, she had observed him in many of his moods and moments, and had even shared casual outings with him. Rides home from the office in the evening, occasional drives, and interactions that, though innocent on the surface, reflected the man's attention toward her. Mrs. Bohannon had noticed this as well, for Bohannon's interest in the young stenographer had not gone entirely unnoticed in the household. On that Saturday morning, Norma dutifully went to the office, performing her work with the quiet efficiency for which she was known. By the afternoon, as was her customary routine, she took time off, her thoughts weighed down by anxiety over Bohannon's condition. Attempting to visit him at the hospital, she was met with the cold barrier of hospital regulations and denied entry to his room. In the lobby, her path crossed with Mrs. Bohannon, and Norma, gathering her courage, approached her. "Mrs. Bohannon, may I have a minute with you? I want to talk to you," she said, her voice a mixture of urgency and timidity. But before a word could be exchanged, Mrs. Bohannon was summoned to her husband's bedside, leaving Norma standing alone, the chance for private conversation slipping away forever. That would be the last time Norma saw Mrs. Bohannon. a fleeting and poignant moment lost to circumstance. Returning home that evening, Norma remained enveloped in a brooding melancholy, her thoughts entirely consumed by the unfolding drama surrounding Bohannon's life and the uncertainty of his fate. She was silent, introspective, and withdrawn, her only concern the welfare of the man she had known so intimately in the context of her work, and a shadow of unease that had begun to creep into her young, fragile mind. The tiny bits of paper strewn across the kitchen floor were fragments of Norma's last thoughts, a shattered window into the turmoil of her mind. Though mostly undecipherable, they hinted at a mixture of despair, fear, and a desire to protect those she cared for. The one complete note, "I want my mother to have everything I own," Norma, made it clear that she wished to provide for her mother even in death, leaving behind a trace of care amidst the tragedy. Perhaps the fragments contained attempts to explain her actions, to confess knowledge of what had happened that fateful night, or to express feelings she could not otherwise voice. They were the silent remnants of a life abruptly ended, offering only glimpses into her heart and the torment she endured in those final, lonely moments. The unanswered questions surrounding Norma Fugger remain the most haunting legacy of the Bohannon case, lingering like a shadow over Evansville long after the courts fell silent. Why had she torn her note into bits? Was it an act of panic, shame, indecision, or a last effort to erase words she feared might hurt her mother or condemn her own name? Or had another hand destroyed those fragments, silencing a truth that might have altered everything we believe about that night? No one can say what Norma wrote in those final minutes as she laid bare her soul, alone with her thoughts and her terror. Paisley himself could not identify her as the girl in Bohannon's car. Brought face to face with her body in the morgue, he could only shake his head and say, "I don't know," offering neither accusation nor absolution. His own fate was later sealed, not by the electric chair the state demanded, but by a life sentence imposed by a judge who would never condemn a man to death. Yet even his punishment brought no clarity. And so Evansville continues to speak of the Bohannon case in hushed tones, always circling back to the same unresolved question. Was Norma Fugger, the quiet, pretty 20-year-old stenographer, the woman beside William O. Bohannon on his final, fatal journey, or was she an innocent soul crushed beneath the weight of suspicion, fear, and the threat of public shame? The truth, if it was ever fully written, was torn apart and carried with her into the grave, leaving behind only doubt, sorrow, and a mystery time has never been able to erase. Case 9, on the crisp morning of May 25th, 1979, 8-year-old Eden Patz prepared for what was meant to be a simple, ordinary journey. A short walk from his family's apartment in the Soho neighborhood of Manhattan to catch a school bus at the corner of West Broadway and Prince Street. It was the first time he would make this trip entirely on his own, a milestone his parents marked with both pride and nervous anticipation. Eden wore a playful black pilot's cap emblazoned with the words "Future Flight Captain," a snug blue corduroy jacket, well-worn blue jeans, and his favorite pair of sneakers, streaked with fluorescent stripes that reflected the morning sunlight as he set out from the apartment at 113 Prince Street. With a quick glance back toward the apartment, he disappeared down the familiar streets of Soho, blending into the bustling flow of pedestrians and the occasional taxi, unaware that this routine morning would mark the beginning of a harrowing mystery. When the school bell rang and Eden did not arrive in his classroom, his teacher took note of his absence, but by the day's end, did not escalate the matter to the principal. The small lapse in attention allowed the hours to pass without anyone realizing that something was seriously wrong. When the afternoon waned and Eden still had not returned home, worry escalated in the Patz household. His mother, Julie, feeling an acute sense of dread, contacted the police, reporting her son missing. What began as parental concern quickly became a full-scale investigation as detectives arrived to assess the situation. In the earliest hours of their inquiry, they briefly considered the possibility that the Patzes themselves might be involved, a standard procedure in missing child cases, but these suspicions were quickly dismissed after thorough questioning and verification of the family's routines. From that evening onward, the search for Eden transformed into a massive, city-wide operation. Nearly 100 police officers joined forces with specially trained bloodhounds, scouring the neighborhood block by block, alley by alley, for any trace of the boy. Neighbors were canvassed tirelessly, residents questioned, and every lead meticulously logged, though many proved to be false or inconclusive. The city streets of Soho, usually filled with the hum of commerce and the chatter of residents, became a landscape of anxious eyes and worried faces as the search intensified. Missing child posters, each bearing a portrait of Etten, were plastered across street corners, subways, and shop windows, a haunting reminder of the boy who had vanished so suddenly from sight. Despite these efforts, the trail remained frustratingly cold. The community and law enforcement alike were left with the chilling uncertainty of a child lost in a vast, teeming city, and the weeks that followed saw continued searches, pleas for information, and an enduring sense of helplessness that would linger in the hearts of those who knew and loved Etten Patz. Etten's father, Stanley Patz, a professional photographer, had always captured the world through a lens, preserving moments of beauty, family, and childhood innocence. His collection of photographs of Etten, spanning the boy's earliest months to that fateful morning in May 1979, became a crucial tool in the search for his son. These images, showing Etten's bright face, dark hair, and unmistakable expressions of curiosity and mischief, were circulated widely, plastered on thousands of missing child posters across New York City and beyond. Stanley's photographs appeared on milk cartons, in newspapers, and even projected on massive screens in Times Square, their repeated exposure transforming Etten's face into a symbol of a city's collective anxiety and hope. Every photograph told a story of the boy's life. His small hands, his playful gaze, his carefully chosen pilot cap. But each also served as a haunting reminder of the child who had vanished without a trace, igniting public attention and keeping the search alive over years. Why 1985, the investigation had evolved into a complex legal and law enforcement pursuit that stretched beyond New York. Assisting United States Attorney Stewart R. Bois took charge of the case and soon identified a new suspect, Jose Antonio Ramos, a convicted child sexual abuser who had been linked socially to Etten through his former babysitters. Ramos had a disturbing history in the early 1980s. Multiple young boys had accused him of attempting to lure them into a drain pipe near the area where he lived, a chilling pattern that alarmed authorities. During a police search of that drain pipe, officers discovered photographs of Ramos with young boys who bore a strong resemblance to Etten, intensifying suspicions. Ramos's criminal record included unrelated convictions for sexual abuse of children, and it was later revealed that he had served time in Pennsylvania for similar offenses. Bois, seeking to connect Ramos to Etten's disappearance, was deputized in 1990 as a deputy state attorney general in Pennsylvania to assist in child abuse cases involving Ramos. This allowed him to obtain additional evidence and interrogate Ramos regarding his possible involvement in the Patz case. During questioning, Ramos made a chilling statement. He admitted that, on the day of Etten's disappearance, he had taken a young boy back to his apartment with the intention of sexually abusing him. While he did not name Etten specifically, he claimed that he was 90% sure that the boy he had taken was the same one he later saw on television in news reports about the missing child. Ramos added that he had subsequently placed the boy on a subway train heading uptown, leaving investigators to grapple with the uncertainty and horror of what may have happened during those critical hours. By 1991, nearly 12 years after Etten's disappearance, new developments injected a fresh wave of hope and urgency into the investigation. While Jose Antonio Ramos was incarcerated for unrelated offenses, a jailhouse informant came forward with information that stunned investigators. The informant told Assisting United States Attorney Stewart R. Bois and FBI agent Mary Galligan that Ramos had confessed knowledge of what had happened to Etten. In a chilling demonstration of his familiarity with the child's routine, Ramos even drew a detailed map of the school bus route that Etten would have taken, correctly marking the boy's stop as the third one along the line. This revelation suggested a level of premeditation and awareness that reinforced suspicions of Ramos's involvement in the disappearance. Despite these alarming details, legal and procedural barriers in the early 1980s had prevented authorities from prosecuting Ramos. For nearly 2 decades, his name remained linked to Etton's case in the public imagination, yet he avoided criminal charges related to the boy's disappearance. The New York Post highlighted Ramos as the prime suspect in a special feature on missing children published on October 21, 1999, reminding the public of the unresolved tragedy. To the Pats family, Ramos had always been the central figure in their suspicions, though the law had yet to catch up with that suspicion. Meanwhile, Etton's body was never recovered. In the absence of physical evidence, the legal system ultimately declared Etton Pats legally dead on June 19, 2001, more than 2 decades after his disappearance. Grieving but resolute, Stan and Julie Pats pursued justice through civil channels, filing a wrongful death lawsuit against Ramos in New York State Court. Ramos, however, refused to answer questions under oath, denying responsibility and avoiding direct confrontation with the family's claims. Undeterred, the Patses pressed on, and in 2004 the court issued a judgment in their favor, awarding them $2 million in damages. Yet this victory was hollow in practical terms. Ramos never paid the judgment, leaving the family with emotional validation, but no financial recompense. Even after the judgment, the Patses maintained a personal, symbolic campaign for accountability. Each year, on both Etton's birthday and the anniversary of his disappearance, Stan Pats sent Ramos a copy of the boy's missing child poster. On the reverse side of each poster, he typed the same haunting question, "What did you do to my little boy?" This ritual, while powerless legally, kept Etton's memory alive and served as a poignant message to Ramos, whose public denials of any involvement continued unabated. That Ramos's criminal record included a 20-year prison sentence for child molestation at the State Correctional Institution in Dallas, Pennsylvania, and he was released on November 7, 2012. Soon after his release, he was arrested for violating Megan's Law, though these charges were unrelated to Etton's disappearance. Over time, the Patses reassessed their pursuit of Ramos. Following the trial of Pedro Hernandez in 2015, which ultimately secured a conviction in connection with Etton's disappearance and murder, Stan and Julie Pats formally dismissed their 2004 judgment against Ramos, acknowledging that he had not been responsible for their son's death. Through decades of uncertainty, legal battles, and public attention, the Patses' journey reflected the tireless persistence of a family determined to honor the memory of their child, while the shadow of Ramos, once their primary suspect, gradually receded in light of the new evidence and legal outcomes that finally clarified the truth. Decades after Etton's disappearance, the case that had haunted New York City for over 30 years was officially reopened. On May 25, 2010, Manhattan District Attorney Cyrus Vance, Jr., announced that investigators would revisit the cold case with renewed resources and modern forensic techniques. The city, still haunted by the memory of the boy who vanished from Soho on a sunny May morning in 1979, watched closely as authorities began retracing old leads with the hope of finally uncovering the truth. By April 19, 2012, a significant investigative effort was underway. FBI agents and NYPD detectives descended on the Soho neighborhood, focusing on 127 B Prince Street, a building just steps from the Pats family's former apartment. The residence had been remodeled multiple times since 1979, but investigators were particularly interested in the basement, which had once served as a handyman's workshop and storage area. Over the course of 4 days, the team meticulously excavated the space, carefully sifting through decades of debris and structural modifications. Dust and shadows filled the basement as officers worked tirelessly. Yet despite the precision and thoroughness of the search, authorities ultimately reported that the excavation yielded nothing conclusive. While the outcome was disappointing, the investigation itself signaled that the case was far from dormant and that modern investigative tools could finally provide the answers that had eluded the city for decades. Then, just over a month later, on May 24, 2012, a breakthrough electrified the city. New York Police Commissioner Raymond Kelly announced that a suspect was in custody who had confessed to involvement in Eden's disappearance. The man, later identified by law enforcement officials as 51-year-old Pedro Hernandez from Maple Shade, New Jersey, had implicated himself in the boy's fate. Hernandez, who had been just 18 years old at the time of Eden's disappearance, provided investigators with a chilling admission. "I'm sorry, I shook him," he wrote in his confession. At the time, Hernandez had been working in a neighborhood convenience store and had interacted with children in the local area, including Eden, who had $1 in his pocket and had told his parents he planned to buy a soda with his lunch that morning. Hernandez went further in describing his actions. He confessed to police that, after attacking Eden, he had disposed of the boy's remains by throwing them into the garbage, an act that left authorities with no recoverable evidence at the time. Based solely on his confession, Hernandez was charged with second-degree murder. Law enforcement officials noted that while the written statement was detailed, there was no physical evidence at that moment to corroborate Hernandez's account. Nonetheless, the confession represented the first major lead in over 30 years and offered a potential resolution to a case that had long tormented the Pats family and the city at large. After Pedro Hernandez's confession in May 2012, investigators worked to corroborate the statements he had made. In a surprising turn, a man named Jose Lopez from New Jersey came forward later that year, convinced that Hernandez, his brother-in-law, was behind Eden's disappearance. Lopez's testimony opened a window into decades-old knowledge within Hernandez's family. Statements from Hernandez's sister, Nina Hernandez, along with accounts from Tomas Rivera, a leader of a charismatic Christian congregation at St. Anthony of Padua Church in Camden, suggested that Hernandez may have openly admitted to the crime in front of fellow parishioners back in the early 1980s. According to his sister, it was regarded within the family as an open secret that Hernandez had confessed in the church. These accounts provided investigators with additional context and supported the validity of his later written confession. On November 14, 2012, a New York grand jury indicted Pedro Hernandez on charges of second-degree murder and first-degree kidnapping, officially charging him in the long unsolved case. Hernandez's defense attorney highlighted significant concerns about his client's mental and intellectual capacity. Hernandez had been diagnosed with schizotypal personality disorder, a condition that can include hallucinations and distorted perceptions of reality. His lawyer also pointed out that Hernandez had a very low intelligence quotient, estimated at around 70, placing him at the borderline of intellectual disability. These factors would play a crucial role in the legal strategy for the defense. When Hernandez appeared in court on December 12, 2012, he pled not guilty to the 2 counts of murder and 1 count of kidnapping. The defense argued that Hernandez's confession could not be taken at face value, emphasizing that it had been obtained after nearly 7 hours of questioning and contained inconsistencies and unverifiable details. In April 2013, Hernandez's legal aid lawyer, Harvey Fishbein, formally filed a motion to dismiss the charges, describing the confession as false, peppered with questionable claims, and unreliable. The prosecution, however, maintained that the confession, along with the corroborating evidence and witness statements, was sufficient to pursue the case. In May 2013, New York Supreme Court Judge Maxwell Wiley ruled that the evidence presented was legally sufficient to move forward with the trial. He further ordered a hearing to determine whether Hernandez's statements would be admissible as evidence in court, setting the stage for one of the most highly anticipated trials in New York criminal history. In September 2014, a pretrial hearing was held to examine the legal admissibility of statements made by Pedro Hernandez before he had been formally informed of his Miranda rights. The focus of this hearing was not on whether the content of his statements was true or false, but rather on whether Hernandez had been in a position to freely exercise his rights during questioning. The court needed to determine whether he understood the significance of his right to remain silent, his right to an attorney, and whether he was competent to waive those rights at the time. This decision carried enormous weight because it would ultimately decide whether any statements Hernandez made after the initial questioning could be used in court. The actual evaluation of the veracity of Hernandez's claims was reserved for the trial, which would officially commence on January 5th, 2015, when the trial began, it drew intense attention due to the notoriety of the case and the decades-long gap since Eden Patz's disappearance. However, after months of testimony, the proceedings ended in a deadlock in May 2015. The jury, unable to reach a unanimous decision, returned a split verdict. 11 jurors favor conviction, while 1 dissented. This resulted in a mistrial, and prosecutors immediately began preparations for a retrial, determined to secure justice after more than 35 years since Eden vanished. The retrial began on October 19, 2016, in a New York City court. For weeks, jurors heard detailed testimony from law enforcement officers, forensic experts, and family members, all outlining the events surrounding Eden's disappearance and Hernandez's confessions. By February 2017, after extensive deliberations, the jury returned a verdict. On February 14th, Hernandez was found guilty of kidnapping and felony murder, crimes that carried the potential of a life sentence. The court moved cautiously in the sentencing phase to allow Hernandez's attorneys time to review the verdict and challenge any procedural concerns. On April 18, 2017, Hernandez was formally sentenced to life imprisonment, with the possibility of parole after serving a minimum of 25 years. This sentence reflected both the severity of the crimes and the prolonged suffering endured by the Patz family over decades. Hernandez's conviction was later reviewed on appeal, and on March 26, 2020, the appellate court unanimously upheld the verdict, reinforcing the legal foundation of the trial. However, the legal journey was far from over. On July 21, 2025, a federal appellate court issued a dramatic ruling, reversing Hernandez's conviction. The court determined that Hernandez was entitled either to a new trial or, failing that, to be released from prison. This decision once again reopened a chapter of uncertainty in the case that had captivated the nation for decades. On November 25, 2025, Manhattan District Attorney Alvin Bragg announced that the office would proceed with a retrial, with a deadline set to begin proceedings by June 1, 2026. The Patz family, law enforcement, and the public once again awaited the unfolding of a trial that would aim to finally resolve one of New York City's most enduring and tragic mysteries. In 1983, the tragic anniversary of Eden Patz's disappearance on May 25th was formally recognized in the United States as National Missing Children's Day. This observance was created to honor missing children, raise public awareness about child abduction, and encourage communities to take a more active role in protecting children. Over the years, the significance of this day expanded beyond the United States. By 2001, the tribute had become international, with countries around the world observing International Missing Children's Day to shine a spotlight on the ongoing challenges of child safety and recovery. The International Center for Missing and Exploited Children, ICMEC, coordinates a global campaign called Help Bring Them Home, which operates in over 20 countries. This initiative works to highlight unresolved cases, provide resources for families of missing children, and mobilize law enforcement and the public to assist in locating and safely returning missing minors. Through events, educational programs, and public outreach, the campaign has strengthened international cooperation in child protection. Eden Patz's disappearance had a profound and lasting effect on American society. The case received extraordinary media coverage, which in turn brought national attention to the problem of child abduction. Parents, increasingly aware of potential dangers, became more cautious about allowing their children to travel alone. Public campaigns began widely distributing photographs of missing children, sometimes even on everyday items like milk cartons. Additionally, the concept of stranger danger became part of the national dialogue, emphasizing to children and parents alike that adults who were not personally known to them could pose potential threats. The legacy of Eden Patz's case continues to influence child safety initiatives to this day, serving as a stark reminder of the vulnerability of children and the need for ongoing vigilance, education, and support in safeguarding young lives.